The rain arrived without warning, transforming the manicured gardens of the Valencia state into a battlefield of sound. Thunder rolled across the darkness like artillery fire, while lightning illuminated the sprawling mansion in violent flashes of white. Inside the master bedroom on the third floor, Eliza Hart stood motionless before the full-length mirror. Her reflection was fractured by sheets of water cascading down the glass behind her. She looked like someone else entirely. The silk nightgown Adrian had chosen for her was ice blue and obscenely expensive. It hung from her shoulders like a costume from someone else's life. Her dark hair, once perpetually tied back in a practical ponytail during her waitressing shifts, now fell in soft waves around her face. It had been professionally styled by people whose names she didn't know. Her skin glowed with products that cost more than her childhood home. But beneath the surface perfection, beneath the luxury that surrounded her like a gilded cage, Eliza's hands trembled as she pressed them against her stomach. 13 weeks. The doctor Adrian didn't know she'd seen had confirmed it 3 days ago. It was during the single unsupervised hour she'd managed to steal in 6 months. She was 13 weeks into carrying a secret that would either be her salvation or her final chain. The black duffel bag waited beneath her bed. It was packed with methodical precision over the past 11 days. It held no luxury items, nothing that screamed wealth or Adrian's ownership. There were just practical clothes and cash she'd skimmed from household accounts in amounts too small to trigger alerts. There were also forged documents purchased through a contact her former co-worker had provided. A single manila envelope contained ultrasound images she hadn't yet had the courage to look at, and baby clothes. 3 tiny outfits she'd bought from a discount store during that precious unsupervised hour were hidden at the bottom of the bag like contraband. Because that's what they were in Adrian's world. They were evidence of futures he didn't control, proof of choices made without his permission. Eliza's phone, the one Adrian had given her, sat on the nightstand where it always rested. It was monitored and tracked. Her real phone, a cheap prepaid model, stayed buried in her cosmetics bag where his security sweeps never looked. On it was a single message she'd received 2 hours ago. It confirmed a meeting and said he'd be gone until at least 3 a.m. His primary detail would go with him. The secondary shift changed at midnight, and her window of opportunity would open at 12:47. She would have 18 minutes. The text came from Marcus Webb, head of Adrian's household security. He was the same Marcus who had a 6-year-old daughter. Her custody hearing was financed by Adrian when his ex-wife tried to relocate across the country. He was also the same Marcus whose eyes had lingered on Eliza with something that looked almost like sympathy. It was when Adrian's grip on her wrist left bruises she couldn't quite hide. She didn't trust Marcus. She couldn't afford to. But desperation made strange allies. Another flash of lightning turned the room daylight bright. In that moment, Eliza saw herself clearly. She was 24 years old, trapped in a world she'd stumbled into through nothing more than bad luck and worse timing. 6 months ago, she'd been nobody. She was a waitress working double shifts at a downtown restaurant, with crushing student debt from a nursing degree she'd never finished. She'd been sharing a cramped apartment with 2 roommates who stole her food and never paid utilities on time. Then Adrian Valente walked into Romano's on a Thursday night in March. She remembered every detail with the crystal clarity of a moment when your entire life pivots without permission. He'd been alone, which was unusual for a man of his reputation. He was sitting at a corner table with a book she couldn't identify and an expression of such complete isolation it made her chest ache. When she approached to take his order, their eyes met and something shifted in the air between them. She had asked if he was having a rough day, then immediately regretted the familiar tone. Rich men didn't appreciate waitresses who spoke to them like human beings. But Adrian had smiled, actually smiled. He'd replied that it had been a rough year. He then asked what she would recommend for existential exhaustion. She'd suggested whiskey and the lasagna. He told her he'd have it in that order. He'd laughed, a real laugh, not the cold sound she'd later learn he used in business meetings. Then he said that's what he'd have, along with her opinion on something. Eliza had glanced at her, expecting an intervention, but the floor was quiet. She told him her opinion wasn't worth much. He said he'd be the judge of that and gestured to the empty chair across from him. He offered her a week's wages for 5 minutes of conversation. She should have walked away. She should have recognized the danger in his expensive suit, the way other diners watched him with careful eyes, and the impossible authority in his posture. But student loans didn't pay themselves, and her landlord had started making threatening noises about next month's rent. So, she'd sat and talked, and somehow, impossibly, made him laugh 3 more times. When her shift ended at midnight, Adrian was waiting by her bus stop with an offer for dinner at a real restaurant. Not as a customer and server, but as 2 people having a conversation, nothing more. His driver would take her home afterward, and if she never wanted to see him again, he'd respect that completely. Every instinct screamed danger. But there was something in his eyes, some vast loneliness that mirrored her own, that made her say yes. That first dinner became a second, then a third. He never lied about who he was or what he did. Adrian Valente, 36 years old, was the head of an organization that controlled significant portions of the city's less legal enterprises. He was a man who wielded power like other people breathed. But with her, he was different. He was careful, almost gentle. During their 4th dinner at a rooftop restaurant where they were the only customers, he told her that he didn't have a normal life. He said he gave that up a long time ago, but when he was with her, he remembered what it felt like to want it. The courtship, if it could be called that, lasted 6 weeks. It was 6 weeks of expensive dinners and thoughtful conversations. Adrian asked about her abandoned nursing career and actually listened to her answers. There were moments when she almost forgot the violence that funded his world. He never touched her beyond holding her hand, and he never pushed for more than she offered. Then everything changed. The night 3 men followed her home from work. She'd noticed them a block from Romano's. They were too well dressed for the neighborhood, moving with coordinated precision. When she'd quickened her pace, they'd matched it. When she'd ducked into a corner store, they'd waited outside. Her hands had shaken as she'd texted Adrian that she thought she was being followed by 3 men and that she was scared. His response was immediate. He just wrote, "Address now." She'd barely typed it when the store owner pulled her toward the back room. He was an elderly Korean man who knew her as a regular. He told her to stay there behind the locked door and not to open it for anyone but the police. She heard the sound of car tires screeching outside, then shouting, then gunfire. The sharp cracks made her scream and drop to the floor behind a stack of rice bags. It lasted maybe 90 seconds. Then there was silence. When Adrian had opened the back room door, there had been blood on his shirt cuff. There was also something feral in his eyes that disappeared the instant he saw her. He'd pulled her against his chest and said she was safe, that he had her. She'd later learned the men were sent by a rival organization, testing Adrian's vulnerabilities. They'd identified her as a potential weakness, a soft target. The message was clear. Anyone close to Adrian Valente became a target. The next day, still shaking, she told him she couldn't see him anymore. She said she couldn't live like this. He had replied with a gentle but absolute voice, telling her not to. He said she could come live with him, protected and safe. She'd never have to worry about rent or loans or men following her in the dark. He told her he could give her everything. All she had to do was trust him. She'd said yes. What choice did she have? Her apartment lease was ending. Her debt was crushing, and the fear of those 90 seconds of gunfire still lived in her bones. But she'd misunderstood the price of safety in Adrian's world. The first month had been a dream. The estate was beautiful, with 40 acres of gardens and guest houses. A staff catered to her every need, and she had a closet full of designer clothes she'd never have to pay for. Adrian gave her a credit card with no limit and asked only that she have dinner with him each evening. He wanted her to share her days and her thoughts. It seemed too good to be true, because it was. The restrictions started small. A suggestion that she not visit her old neighborhood because it was too dangerous. A gentle insistence that his driver take her anywhere she needed to go. Asking why she would risk public transportation. A request that she inform his assistant of her schedule, purely for coordination purposes. Then came the night she'd tried to meet her former roommate for coffee without mentioning it first. When she returned, Adrian had been waiting in the foyer. His voice was soft but terrible as he asked where she was. He said he had called and she didn't answer. She started to explain she just went out, but he cut her off. His voice was like ice as he repeated, "Where were you?" The chill in those 3 words had frozen her blood. For the first time, she'd seen the man his enemies feared. Not the gentle dinner companion or thoughtful conversationalist, but the Adrian who controlled an empire through careful violence. She explained she was having coffee with Sarah, her old roommate. She said she just wanted to, but he interrupted. He questioned why she would go without telling him, without security. He'd stepped closer, and she'd instinctively stepped back. He asked if she understood what could have happened after what had happened before. He said she left the property without protection, without informing anyone, and wondered why he was upset. She didn't think she needed permission. The word permission came out sharp enough to cut. He told her it wasn't about permission, it was about keeping her alive. He said the moment she became his, she became a target. Every enemy he had would try to use her against him. So yes, she needed to tell him where she was going. She needed security. And she needed to understand that her freedom to wander wherever she pleased ended the night he saved her life. She'd wanted to argue, wanted to scream that she wasn't his possession, but the fear in his eyes had been real. And beneath her anger, she'd understood his logic, even as she hated it. That was the trap of Adrian Valente. He was never cruel without reason, never controlling without justification. Every restriction came wrapped in genuine care. Every boundary was drawn to protect rather than punish. But the result was the same. She was a prisoner in a golden cage, and the man she'd thought might save her from loneliness had become her jailer instead. The baby had changed everything. Eliza pressed her palm against her stomach again. She felt nothing yet, but knew everything had already transformed. This child, Adrian's child, though he didn't know it existed, was either her ticket to freedom or the final lock on her cage. If she told him, he would never let her go. A child meant legacy, meant continuing the Valente name. It meant binding her to him permanently through ties that went deeper than any legal contract. He would marry her, shower her with everything money could buy, and ensure she never made a decision about her own life again. But if she ran now, while he didn't know, while she still had the element of surprise, the burner phone vibrated. It was Marcus again, asking for her status. Eliza typed quickly that she was ready. He replied that Adrian had just left for a high-stakes meeting across town and took his primary detail. She was clear to go. She moved fast. She pulled on dark jeans and a nondescript hoodie and stripped off every piece of jewelry Adrian had given her. The engagement ring sat heavy in her palm. It was 3 carats, flawless. He'd presented it 6 weeks ago during a dinner where he'd informed her, rather than asked, that they would marry in the fall. She stared at it for a long moment, remembering his face when he'd slid it onto her finger. He'd said she was his now, officially and forever. He'd said he'd give her everything, everything except the option to leave. She set the ring on the nightstand and didn't look back. The estate security system was sophisticated, but operated on predictable patterns. Marcus had walked her through the blind spots. These were areas where camera coverage overlapped imperfectly, creating 3-second windows of invisibility. There was the hallway outside her room, the service stairs leading to the kitchen, and the side door near the garbage area. The night cleaning crew propped it open during their smoke breaks. Eliza moved through the sleeping mansion like a ghost, the duffel bag weighing heavy on her shoulder. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like thunder. Every shadow looked like one of Adrian's security team, materializing to drag her back. But she made it to the service stairs, down 3 and through the industrial kitchen that smelled of tomorrow's breakfast preparations. The side door stood 15 feet away. Freedom, the storm, the night, the chance to disappear. Then a voice asked if she was going somewhere, Miss Hart. Her heart stopped. She turned slowly to find Kyle Morrison, one of the junior security officers. He was standing in the doorway to the staff break room. He was 23 years old, new to Adrian's organization, and still unsure of his place in the hierarchy. Eliza's mind raced. She said she couldn't sleep and thought she'd get some air. Kyle's eyes dropped to the duffel bag. He said she had luggage. She insisted it wasn't what it looked like. He replied that it looked like she was running. He stepped closer, his hand moving toward the radio on his belt. He said Mr. Valente was going to want to know about this. Eliza made a choice. She lied and said that he beat her. She told Kyle to look, pulling up her sleeve to reveal a bruise. It was actually from bumping into a door frame, but could be anything in the right light. She claimed he said if she ever told anyone, if she ever tried to leave, he'd kill her. She pleaded with Kyle. She seemed like a good person, and asked him to just let her go and pretend he never saw her. It was a gamble. Kyle was new, idealistic, and still believed in good guys and bad guys. He'd seen Adrian's cold side, the merciless businessman who crushed opposition without hesitation. The young officer's face went through a complicated series of expressions: doubt, concern, and the dawning horror of someone realizing they work for a monster. Eliza pressed on. She said she didn't have much time and that he'd be back soon. She begged him, please. Kyle's hand fell away from his radio. He told her the North Garden Gate code was 4729. He said to go straight to the service road. A taxi company usually parked near a corner store about a mile down. He added that if anyone asked, he never saw her. Relief nearly buckled her knees. She thanked him so much. Kyle just looked miserable and told her to go before he changed his mind. She ran. The storm hit her like a physical force the moment she cleared the door. Rain soaked through her hoodie in seconds, turning the gravel path into a treacherous obstacle course. Lightning illuminated the garden in stroboscopic flashes. It showed statues and fountains and perfectly manicured hedges that represented everything beautiful and suffocating about Adrian's world. The north gate materialized through the downpour. Eliza's fingers shook as she punched in the code, 4729. The lock clicked open. She was through and running before her conscious mind caught up with her body. The service road stretched before her, empty and dark. Her shoes slapped against wet pavement as she sprinted away from the estate, away from Adrian, away from the life she'd never chosen. Behind her, the Valente mansion receded into the storm like a dark palace from a nightmare. Ahead was only darkness and rain, and the desperate hope that freedom was possible for someone like her. The taxi driver who picked her up near the corner store asked no questions. He just saw a soaking wet young woman with a single duffel bag who paid cash and requested the bus station downtown. The bus station attendant didn't blink when she bought a ticket to Cleveland, using a name that wasn't quite her own. The other passengers on the 2 a.m. Greyhound didn't care about the girl in the back, who kept checking her phone every few minutes. She was waiting for it to explode with calls from Adrian's number, but her phone stayed silent. Either Marcus was covering for her, or Adrian's meeting was running so late he hadn't yet discovered her absence. Either way, every mile between her and the estate felt like breathing for the first time in months. Cleveland came and went, then Pittsburgh. Each transfer took her further from Adrian's territory, deeper into the anonymous vastness of the country. She paid for everything in cash, used different names at each stop, and wore the baseball cap Marcus had included in his care package. It was for camera blind spots, he'd said, and told her to wear it everywhere. 72 hours after leaving the estate, Eliza Hart crossed the border into Canada. She used documents that identified her as Emma Hayes, an administrative assistant visiting Toronto for a conference. The customs officer barely glanced at her passport. He asked her purpose of visit, and she said, tourism. She said a friend had recommended she see the city. He asked how long she'd be staying, and she said 2 weeks. He stamped her passport and waved her through. Just like that, she was free. She was in a new country with a new name, carrying a secret that Adrian Valente, the most dangerous man she'd ever known, didn't know existed. Toronto sprawled before her like a promise. The taxi driver, who drove her from the border crossing into the city center, spoke in an accent she couldn't place. He pointed out landmarks she didn't care about. All she saw was possibility, anonymity, a place where Adrian's network didn't reach, a place where his security cameras didn't watch, and where she could finally be just Eliza again. The apartment she found was everything the estate wasn't. It was tiny, just a studio in a building that had seen better days. The furniture was secondhand, the view was a brick wall, and the bathroom had questionable plumbing. But it was hers, rented under her false name with cash and a forged reference letter. The landlord seemed to specialize in tenants who valued privacy, and he asked no questions. That first night, alone in her new space with the door locked and the deadbolt thrown, Eliza sat on the floor and cried. Relief, terror, exhaustion, all of it pouring out in a storm that matched the one she'd fled through. When the tears finally stopped, she pulled out the ultrasound images she'd been too afraid to look at before. There, in grainy black and white, was the future she was fighting for. It was a tiny shape barely recognizable as human, floating in darkness. It was the beginning of a person who deserved better than to grow up in Adrian's world, owned before they were even born. She whispered to the image that she was going to keep them safe, no matter what it took. The next morning, she found work at a cafe 3 blocks from her apartment. The owner, a woman named Patricia who'd immigrated from Jamaica 30 years ago, only asked if she could start immediately. She also asked if she was running from something. Eliza admitted yes to both. Patricia had looked her over with shrewd eyes and asked if she could make coffee and keep her drama away from her customers. Eliza said absolutely. Patricia replied that they understood each other then, and that she was Emma here, and she didn't need to know anything else. The job paid cash under the table. The hours were long but manageable. The customers were a mix of students, office workers, and people like her, those who'd come to Toronto to be someone new. Days became a week, and a week became 2. Eliza, now Emma, fell into a routine that felt almost normal. She'd wake at 6, walk to the cafe, make coffee, smile at strangers, and pocket tips that slowly built toward a future. She'd close at 3, walk home, stop at the grocery store for simple meals, and spend evenings reading pregnancy books from the public library. She was planning for a baby she was terrified and thrilled to meet. She found a prenatal clinic that didn't ask too many questions. The doctor was an older woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. She confirmed everything was progressing normally. Dr. Singh had asked if it was her first pregnancy, and she said yes. When asked about the father, she said he wasn't in the picture. Dr. Singh had simply nodded and asked if she had support from friends or family. Eliza replied that she would, that she was building it. It wasn't entirely a lie. She'd started talking to her neighbors, carefully, never revealing too much, but learning their names and sharing coffee in the hallway. She'd struck up friendships with regular customers at the cafe, the kind of casual connections that made her feel human again. For the first time in months, Eliza felt like herself. Not Adrian's possession, not a piece on someone else's chessboard, but a person making choices about her own life. The illusion of safety lasted exactly 17 days. She was working the afternoon shift at the cafe, wiping down tables and chatting with Patricia about inventory when the delivery arrived. A young man in a courier uniform carried an enormous bouquet of long-stemmed roses. They were so deep red they looked black. He announced a delivery for Emma Hayes. Eliza's blood turned to ice. She asked who sent them, and he said there was no name, just instructions to deliver them there. He handed over the bouquet and a small envelope and wished her a nice day. The roses were beautiful, exactly 3 dozen. The same number Adrian had sent to her apartment the day after their first dinner together. The scent was overwhelming, filling the cafe with a fragrance that was both lovely and suffocating. Patricia asked with a raised eyebrow if she had a secret admirer. Eliza couldn't speak. Her hand shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single card written in handwriting she recognized as intimately as her own. It instructed her to be at the penthouse suite of the Royal York Hotel at midnight tonight. It also said, they needed to talk about their future, all 3 of them. The world tilted. He knew about Toronto, about Emma Hayes, and about the baby. Adrian had found her, and he'd been watching her all along. The card fell from Eliza's hands, fluttering to the cafe floor like a wounded bird. Patricia's voice seemed to come from very far away, asking if she was all right, if she needed to sit down. But Eliza couldn't form words. The roses sat on the counter between them, their scent thick enough to choke on. Each perfect bloom was a reminder that nowhere was far enough. No new name was a sufficient disguise, and no border was wide enough to keep Adrian Valente from what he considered his. All 3 of them. He knew about the baby, and had perhaps known from the very beginning. Every careful step she'd taken, every precaution, every moment she'd believed herself free, all of it had been an illusion. Adrian had been watching, tracking, waiting. The question wasn't how he'd found her. The question was why he'd let her run at all. Patricia's hand on her shoulder brought the world back into sharp focus. She said, Emma, honey, you look like you've seen a ghost. Who sent these? Eliza's mind raced through possible answers, discarding each one. The truth was impossible. The Mafia boss she ran from, the father of her unborn child, the man who owned half the northeastern seaboard. But lies felt equally dangerous now. Adrian had found her, and that changed everything. She finally managed to say it was someone from her past. Someone she was hoping would never find me. Patricia's expression shifted from concern to understanding. She'd lived long enough to recognize the particular fear that came with those words. She asked if it was the baby's father. Eliza nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. She added he was not a good man. How did you explain Adrian Valente? Dangerous was too simple. Controlling was incomplete. Monster felt wrong, because monsters didn't look at you with genuine longing. They didn't remember how you took your coffee, or trace your face with such careful reverence when they thought you were sleeping. She said, he's complicated and powerful, and he doesn't let go of things he considers his. Patricia moved with surprising speed for a woman in her 60s. She flipped the cafe sign to closed and locked the front door. She said they needed to get her somewhere safe, that she had family in Montreal. Eliza picked up the card again, staring at Adrian's precise handwriting. It wouldn't matter. Midnight, New York Hotel, 5 hours from now. If he found her here, he could find her anywhere. Running just delayed the inevitable. Patricia asked if she was just going to walk into whatever trap he'd set. Eliza didn't think it was a trap. She touched her stomach, a gesture that was becoming automatic. If Adrian wanted to take her by force, she'd already be gone. The roses, the hotel, the specific time, this was an invitation. He wanted to talk. Patricia warned that men like that don't talk, they take. Eliza hated herself for it, but the words came out defensively. She said Patricia didn't know Adrian. After 6 months of captivity and 17 days of freedom, some part of her still wanted to explain him, to make others understand the impossible contradiction he represented. She said he's not like other men, he's worse in some ways and better in others. But he keeps his word. If he says they need to talk, then that's what he wants. The question was, what would happen after? Patricia studied her with shrewd eyes and asked if she was going to run again. Eliza gestured at the roses, the card, the evidence of Adrian's reach. Where would she go that he couldn't follow? He'd let her have 17 days. 17 days of feeling safe, building a life, believing she'd escaped. But that was always an illusion. He was always going to come. The only question was when. Patricia asked if she was giving up, just surrendering herself and that baby to a man. Eliza said she was going to negotiate. The plan formed even as she spoke it. It crystallized from desperation into something resembling strategy. Adrian thinks she's his, that the baby makes her permanently his. He's wrong, but she couldn't make him understand that by running. She had to face him, set terms, and make him see that if he wants them in his life, it has to be different than before. And if he refused, then she was back in the cage. Only this time with a child who'd grow up knowing nothing but Adrian's suffocating protection. But Eliza didn't say that. Instead, she squeezed Patricia's hand and tried smile. She said at least then she would have tried. She asked for a favor. If she didn't come back tomorrow, if something happened, there was a safety deposit box at the bank on King Street. The keys were in her apartment, taped under the bathroom sink. Inside were documents, everything someone would need to know what had happened to her. Patricia told her to stop talking like she was going to die. Eliza replied that she was talking like she was being realistic. Adrian's world was dangerous, and people disappeared. She needed to know that if something happened to her, someone would know the truth. Patricia's eyes were wet, but she nodded. She said she'd check on her tomorrow. And if she didn't answer her phone by noon, Eliza thanked her. She gathered the roses, their weight substantial in her arms. They were evidence of Adrian's presence, his knowledge, his inevitable claim. She said she should go, that she needed to prepare. The walk back to her apartment felt like moving through water. Every familiar landmark seemed temporary, like borrowed time. The convenience store where she bought milk, the playground where she'd imagined one day bringing her child, the coffee shop where she'd spent mornings reading pregnancy books. Adrian had always been coming, and in her heart, she'd always known it. Inside her tiny studio, Eliza set the roses on the counter and stared at them for a long moment. 3 dozen perfect blooms. The same number he'd sent after their first dinner, before everything had gone wrong, before she'd understood that Adrian's version of love looked remarkably like ownership. She showered, washing away the cafe's coffee smell and the cold sweat of fear. Then she stood before her meager closet, trying to decide what one wore to negotiate with a Mafia boss. The practical clothes she'd accumulated over 17 days felt wrong, too ordinary, too much like the invisibility she'd been cultivating. But she'd left all Adrian's expensive gifts behind at the estate, stripping herself of every marker of his wealth. In the end, she chose simple black pants and a dark blue blouse. It was professional, neutral, the kind of outfit that said she was taking this seriously without playing into his world of luxury. She left her hair loose, a applied minimal makeup, and put on the only jewelry she owned. It was a small silver cross her mother had given her before she died when Eliza was 16 and still believed in protection from higher powers. The evening crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eliza tried to eat but couldn't. She tried to read, but the words wouldn't stick. Instead, she paced her small apartment, her hand pressed to her stomach, talking to the life growing there. She whispered that she was going to try to make this right, but she didn't know if she could. She said their father was everything terrible and everything she should have run from, but he was also the only man who ever made her feel seen, valued, like she mattered. That didn't excuse what he did, keeping her prisoner, but it complicated things. And now, this baby existed and complicated them even more, because whatever happened tonight, whatever she agreed to or refused, she needed them to know that every choice she made was about giving them a better life than she had, a life where they weren't owned, where they were free. The baby, of course, said nothing, but Eliza felt better for speaking the words aloud. She felt better for making promises she desperately hoped she could keep. At 11:15, she called a taxi. The driver was a middle-aged Sikh man who made polite conversation about the weather. He asked no questions about why a young woman was going to an expensive hotel alone at nearly midnight. The Royal York loomed above them as they approached. It was all golden lights and old-world grandeur, exactly the kind of place Adrian would choose for a confrontation. Neutral ground, but still his territory, his wealth and power, and the unspoken understanding that he could afford anything within these walls. Eliza paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the building's illuminated facade. Somewhere up there, Adrian was waiting. Perhaps he'd been here for hours, watching the entrance, tracking her arrival through whatever network he'd used to find her in the first place. Perhaps he was as nervous as she was, though that seemed impossible. Adrian Valente didn't get nervous. He planned, executed, and controlled. But then again, he'd never been a father before. The lobby was elegant and hushed, with marble floors and discreet staff who specialized in not noticing things they weren't meant to see. Eliza walked to the elevator bank, pressed the button for the top floor, and watched the numbers climb with a strange sense of inevitability. This was always how it would end. Her running, him finding her, a confrontation in some expensive space where the rest of the world couldn't reach. The penthouse level had only 2 suites. Adrian's door was obvious. It was the one with a man in a dark suit standing outside. An earpiece was visible, his eyes tracking her approach with professional assessment. She recognized him. Daniel Park, one of Adrian's senior security team. He'd been at the estate, part of the inner circle, someone who'd seen her at breakfast and dinner. He'd pretended not to notice when she cried in the garden. His voice was neutral, giving nothing away as he greeted her. Miss Hart. He said Adrian was expecting her. She was sure he was. Daniel opened the door without further comment. Eliza stepped through and heard it close behind her with a soft click that sounded remarkably like a trap springing shut. The suite was exactly what she'd expected. It was obscenely luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Toronto's glittering skyline. The furniture cost more than most people earned in a year, and the art on the walls probably belonged in museums. And standing by the windows, silhouetted against the city lights, was Adrian Valente. He didn't turn immediately. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight with a tension that most people would never notice. But it was a tension that Eliza had learned to read over 6 months of careful observation. When he finally faced her, his expression was controlled, the mask he wore for business negotiations and dangerous meetings. But his eyes told a different story. Relief, anger, and something that might have been hurt if Adrian Valente was capable of being hurt. He used her real name, Eliza, not the Emma Hayes she'd been hiding behind. He said she looked well, and that Toronto seemed to agree with her. She refused to be intimidated by the opulence, by his presence, or by the fact that he looked exactly as she remembered. Dark hair perfectly styled, an expensive suit fitted like armor, a face too handsome for someone so dangerous. She asked how long he'd known where she was. He replied, since the moment she crossed the border. Adrian moved away from the windows, each step deliberate. He said his people flagged the passport, a good forgery by the way. He noted that Marcus clearly spent some money. He had eyes on her within 6 hours of her arrival in Toronto. She asked why he waited, why he let her think she was free. He said it was because she needed to learn something. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell his cologne. It was that familiar scent that used to make her feel safe and now just made her sad. He said she needed to understand that freedom wasn't about geography. She could run to Toronto, to Vancouver, to anywhere in the world, and he would find her. Not because he owned her, though he knew that's how she saw it, but because she mattered to him. Because the thought of her unprotected, vulnerable, facing dangers he couldn't control was intolerable. So, he let her run just to prove she couldn't escape? He said he let her run because he hoped she'd realize the truth on her own. His voice dropped, becoming almost gentle. He said that wherever she went, whatever name she used, she was still his and he was still hers. He told her that wasn't ownership, it was inevitability. She wanted to argue, to scream that love wasn't supposed to feel like captivity, that caring for someone didn't give you the right to control them. But the baby shifted inside her. Not movement yet. It was too early for that, but a presence she felt regardless. And she remembered why she was here, not to fight, but to negotiate. She looked him in the eyes, refusing to look away. She said his note mentioned they needed to talk about their future, all three of them. She asked if he knew about the baby. He replied that he'd known since before she left. Adrian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He asked if she really thought he wouldn't notice. The prenatal vitamins she hid in her cosmetics bag? The appointment with Dr. Chen that she thought she'd concealed? The way she stopped drinking wine at dinner and started refusing sushi? He'd spent 6 months learning everything about her. He noticed when things changed. The revelation hit like a physical blow. He knew and he said nothing. He let her. He said he was waiting for her to tell him herself, waiting for her to trust him enough to share it. His voice turned harsh, but instead she ran, took his child, their child, and disappeared in the middle of the night like he was some monster she had to escape. The words exploded out of her. "You are a monster, Adrian." Months of repressed anger finally broke free. She said he dressed it up in protection and care and genuine feeling, but the result was the same. She was a prisoner in his home. She couldn't go anywhere, see anyone, or make any decision without his permission. She said he claimed to love her, but love doesn't look like a cage. He moved closer, closing the distance between them, and asked what love looked like. He mentioned the world she came from, working herself to exhaustion for tips and college debt, living with roommates who stole from her, unable to afford basic health care. He said he gave her everything: safety, comfort, a life without worry. If that was a cage, then maybe cages weren't as terrible as she thought. Her voice broke as she said he gave her everything except choice. She hadn't asked for any of it. He asked what she wanted: to struggle alone to raise their child in some cramped apartment, working minimum wage while strangers watched their baby? Did she think that was better than what he could provide? She said she thought it was hers, her choice, her life. Eliza pressed her hands to her stomach, protectively. This baby deserved better than to be born into his world. Better than to grow up owned by him, before they even understood what freedom means. He countered that their baby deserved the best of everything. The finest education, perfect security, every opportunity money could provide. And they deserved two parents who loved them, not a mother running herself ragged, trying to prove a point about independence. She insisted that independence wasn't a point to prove, it was a fundamental right. Adrian's voice went soft, dangerous. He said not in his world. In his world, the people he loved were protected, cared for, kept safe from the 100,000 threats that exist beyond gates and security systems. He saw that as the only way to ensure she survived, even if she saw it as control. Then they were at an impasse. Eliza forced herself to meet his eyes. She said she couldn't live like that again. She wouldn't. If he tried to force her back to the estate, she'd run again and again. And however many times he found her, she'd keep running. Because she'd rather live in that cramped apartment, struggling and exhausted but free, than spend another day in golden captivity. Silence fell between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Adrian's jaw was tight, his hands clenched, every line of his body radiating tension. For a long moment, Eliza thought he might simply end the conversation. She thought he might call in his security and take her back by force, because that was what powerful men did when they didn't get their way. But then, something shifted in his expression. A crack in the armor, a glimpse of the man who'd laughed at her jokes during their first dinner, who'd held her after nightmares. A man who'd once confessed in the darkness that he'd never wanted anything as much as he wanted her happiness. The question came out raw, stripped of his usual control. He asked what she wanted. He told her to tell him what she needed, and he'd give it to her. She said she needed space, boundaries, the ability to make her own decisions without asking permission. She took a breath, steadying herself. She needed him to understand that being with him couldn't mean giving up who she was. That if they were going to raise this child together, and she did want them to know their father despite everything, it had to be as partners. Not owner and possession. Partners. Adrian tested the word like it was foreign. He said she understood what that meant in practical terms. She'd have access to everything he could provide, every resource, every protection. But she'd also be part of his world, his actual world, not the sanitized version he tried to keep her in. She'd see things, know things, be complicit in ways she might not be able to accept. She said she'd rather know the truth than live in ignorant captivity. He warned her the truth was ugly. He'd killed people, ordered deaths, built an empire on violence and fear and calculated cruelty. The money that paid for her comfortable life at the estate came from activities that would horrify her. He'd kept her separate from all that because he wanted her to stay clean, unsullied by the darkness. But she said quietly that she wasn't separate. She stopped being separate the moment he decided she was his. Those men who followed her, who would have hurt or killed her to send a message to him. That was already the consequence of his world touching hers. At least if she knew the truth, she could make informed decisions, protect herself, and protect their child. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He said if he agreed to this, if he gave her the space and boundaries she was asking for, he needed something in return. She asked what? Honesty. Complete transparency. She couldn't hide things from him. She couldn't run without talking to him first. And she had to let him keep her safe, even if she didn't like the methods. He stepped closer. He said he could give her freedom within limits, but he couldn't let her be vulnerable. So, if there was a threat, if his enemies started circling, she had to follow his security protocols without argument. She had to trust that he knew his world better than she did, and let him protect what was his. She corrected him, saying what's ours. She wasn't his. She was her own person. And if they were doing this, he needed to accept that she was a person, not a possession. His voice dropped. He'd always known she was a person. That was the problem. If she were just a possession, he could lock her away and sleep peacefully. But she wasn't. She was smart and stubborn, and she made him want things he'd given up on years ago. Things like partnership and trust, and the possibility that someone might choose to stay with him. Not because they were afraid or trapped, but because they actually wanted to be there. The vulnerability in those words hit harder than any of his earlier arguments. This was the Adrian she'd glimpsed during their courtship. The man beneath the monster, lonely and aching for a connection he didn't know how to accept. Eliza said softly for him to give her a reason to choose him. Not his money or his protection or his power, but him, the man who remembered how she took her coffee and bought out an entire restaurant so they could have a quiet dinner. The man who listened when she talked about her abandoned nursing career and actually cared about her dreams. She told him to be that person, not the one who treated her like another asset to control. He said they were the same person. He couldn't separate the parts of himself she found acceptable from the parts that terrified her. The control, the protection, the need to keep her safe all came from the same place as everything else. He could try to be better, to give her more freedom, but he couldn't promise he'd ever be comfortable with her being vulnerable. She said she wasn't asking him to be comfortable. She was asking him to try. Adrian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. He said if he did this, if he gave her the partnership she was asking for, she had to understand what she was agreeing to. She'd be the wife of Adrian Valente, mother to his heir. Every enemy he had would see her as a target. Every business decision would impact her life. She wouldn't be able to just walk away when things got difficult or frightening. She replied that she was pregnant with his child. She was never going to be able to just walk away. She let herself lean into his touch, feeling the warmth of his skin, the familiar electricity that had drawn her to him from the beginning. But she needed to know that if she stayed, if she agreed to build a life with him, it was because they were choosing each other, not because he was forcing her hand. He said quietly that he could force it, and she knew that. He could have Daniel pack her things right now, put her on his plane, and have her back at the estate before morning. He had the power to simply take what he wanted. Eliza met his eyes, seeing past the threat to the truth beneath. She said he wouldn't, because that's not what he actually wanted. He didn't want a captive or a possession. He wanted someone who chose to be with him, despite knowing exactly who he was. And he couldn't force that. He could only earn it. Something in Adrian's expression softened. He said she was either the bravest or most foolish woman he'd ever met. She managed a small smile and said probably both. So, what happened now? Did she agree to come back and they just pretended the last 17 days never happened? No. Adrian dropped his hands and stepped back, moving to a desk by the window. He returned with a leather folder, setting it on the coffee table between them. He said they would formalize the agreement and make it legally binding. He'd had his attorneys draw it up during her time in Toronto. It was a contract outlining exactly what their partnership would look like. Eliza opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of pages of dense legal text, but the summary section at the front laid it out clearly. It was a prenuptial agreement that was also a partnership contract. It specified her rights, his obligations, the boundaries they'd maintain, and the protections for any children they might have. She read through it slowly, Adrian watching her with unreadable eyes. It was more generous than she'd expected, her own income stream separate from his. Living quarters within the estate that were hers alone, with locks he didn't have keys to. The right to maintain outside friendships and activities, scheduled private time without security surveillance, decisions about their child's upbringing to be made jointly, with specified areas where she had final say. She looked up, searching his face, and asked why he had prepared this if he didn't know whether she'd agree to come back. His voice was rough as he replied that he was hoping. He'd spent 17 days having his people track her every move, watching her build a life in Toronto. He saw her smile more than she ever did at the estate, and he realized something. The woman he fell in love with, the one who made him laugh at Romanos, who challenged him and surprised him and made him want to be better, she was dying in his home. The control he thought was protection was actually suffocation. So, either he could keep her prisoner and watch everything he valued about her disappear, or he could try something different, but partnership. He agreed, partnership, with conditions and boundaries, and probably a lot of fights about what those mean in practice. But yes, an actual partnership, not pretty words covering ownership. Eliza read through the contract again, more carefully this time, looking for catches and loopholes, but it seemed genuine. It was a real attempt to balance his need for control with her need for autonomy. It wasn't perfect. There were clauses about security that still felt restrictive. There were requirements that she inform him of major decisions, and limitations on where she could go without protection. But it was a start, a foundation they could build on. She finally said she needed to add something. A clause about their child specifically, that they won't be raised to follow in his footsteps. That when they're old enough to understand, they get to choose what kind of life they want, legal, illegal, or somewhere in between. That had to be their decision, not theirs. Adrian's jaw tightened. She was asking him to promise not to bring his own child into the family business. She said she was asking him to let them be free, the way neither of them really was. She placed her hand over her stomach. They both knew what it was like to have their paths chosen for them. She wanted better for their baby, and she asked if he didn't too. For a long moment, she thought he'd refuse. The Valente Empire had been built over generations, each heir trained from childhood to take up the mantle. Asking Adrian to break that tradition, to accept that his child might choose a completely different life, was asking him to question everything he'd been raised to believe. But then he nodded slowly and told her to add the clause, but he wanted one condition. They could make that choice as an adult. Until they were 21, they would live under his protection, learn about both worlds, and then decide. He wouldn't force them into his life, but he wouldn't hide it from them either. Agreed. Eliza felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. This was more than she'd hoped for. Not complete freedom, but genuine compromise. So if she signed this, they were really doing this partnership and marriage and raising a child together. He confirmed that if she signed, she was agreeing to be his wife. She was agreeing to stand beside him publicly and privately, and be part of his world with all its complications. Adrian's voice gentled. But yes, it was a partnership. He'd try to give her the space she needed, and she'd try to understand when he couldn't. They'd fight about boundaries and security and 1,000 other things, but they'd do it together. Eliza stared at the contract. It was a promise of a life that was neither the captivity she'd fled, nor the precarious independence she'd been building in Toronto. It was something different, something that acknowledged both Adrian's nature and her own needs. It wasn't perfect, and it might not even be enough. But it was a chance. She said she needed a pen. Adrian produced one from his jacket pocket. It was expensive, gold-plated, exactly the kind of unnecessary luxury that defined his world. Eliza took it and signed her name at the bottom of the contract. Her handwriting looked small and uncertain next to the formal legal text. Adrian signed after her, his signature bold and confident. Then he pulled out his phone and made a brief call. He asked someone named Michael if everything was ready for the flight home. He said yes tonight. Eliza set down the pen and asked if they were leaving now. Adrian gestured at the windows, at the city beyond. He said there was nothing keeping her in Toronto. Her apartment lease was paid through the month. Patricia at the cafe had been compensated generously for her sudden departure, and her few possessions were already packed and waiting downstairs, unless she wanted to stay longer. The efficiency was both impressive and slightly terrifying. She commented that he was very confident she'd agree. He replied that he was very prepared either way. He moved closer. If she'd refused, he was planning to spend the next month in Toronto, having dinner with her every night until she changed her mind. Daniel had already rented an apartment across from hers. He could be very patient when he wanted something badly enough. She said that wasn't patience, it was stalking. He replied that in his world they were often the same thing. Adrian reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. But she didn't refuse. She signed the contract. So now they would go home, plan a wedding, and start building the partnership they both apparently wanted. Eliza caught his hand before he could pull away. She needed him to understand something. She signed because she believed he was trying, because the contract was more than she expected, and because their child deserved to know their father. But trust wasn't automatic. She told him he'd have to earn it every day, and if he broke the terms of this agreement, if he started treating her like a possession again, she would run. He laced his fingers through hers and said he knew. He'd find her, and they'd fight about it, and hopefully, eventually, they'd figure out how to make this actually work. He said that's what partnership meant, right? Constant negotiation. She echoed, constant negotiation. That sounded exhausting. He replied that most worthwhile things are. Adrian pulled her closer, and she let him, feeling the familiar solidity of his body, the warmth that had once made her feel safe. He said that for what it was worth, he'd missed her. The estate was empty without her. He kept expecting to see her in the garden or hear her in the library, and the absence was, he stopped, searching for words. It made him understand that everything he'd built meant nothing if she weren't there to share it. Eliza rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. She said that was almost romantic, in a deeply messed up way. He said he'd never claimed to be healthy or normal. His arms came around her, careful and tentative, as if he expected her to bolt. But he was trying to be better for her, for their child, even if better was a relative term in his world. They stood like that for a long moment. Two people who had found each other through chance and stayed connected through something more complicated than love, but maybe stronger. Outside the windows, Toronto glittered in the darkness. A city that had offered Eliza 17 days of freedom, and then revealed that freedom was more complicated than geography. Adrian finally said they should go. The plane was waiting, and they had a lot to plan. The wedding, nursery preparation, security upgrades. She noted that he was already thinking about security upgrades for a baby who wouldn't be born for 6 more months. He said he'd been thinking about security upgrades since the moment he knew she was pregnant. He pulled back to look at her. Being a father terrified him more than any business negotiation or territorial dispute, because he knew how to handle those threats. But a child, someone small and fragile and completely dependent on him not to screw them up, that was an entirely different kind of danger. The admission surprised her. Adrian Valente terrified. It made him seem more human, more reachable. She said they'd figure it out together. That's what the partnership meant, right? He didn't have to have all the answers. He said he wasn't used to admitting he didn't have answers. She told him to get used to it. Parenthood was apparently all about making it up as you go and hoping you don't damage them too badly. Adrian smiled, a real smile, not the controlled expression he showed the world. He supposed they were starting from an equal position of ignorance. She said that was almost fair. He'd take almost fair. Eliza let him lead her toward the door, toward Daniel waiting outside, toward the car that would take them to the airport, and the plane that would fly them back to the estate. Back to Adrian's world, but this time with contracts and boundaries, and the fragile promise of something like partnership. As they rode the elevator down, Eliza's hand found her stomach again, feeling for the life growing there. She was making a choice. Not the one she'd imagined during those 17 days in Toronto, but maybe the only realistic one available. Adrian was right that running was futile. He would always find her, always bring her back, because that was who he was and what his resources allowed. But the contract changed things. It made her something other than a captive. It wasn't freedom in the pure sense. It wasn't the independence she dreamed of. But it was agency within constraints, power within limits. And maybe with time and patience and constant negotiation, it would be enough. The private jet waited at a small airport outside the city. It was sleek and expensive and entirely too comfortable. Adrian helped her aboard, his hand steady at the small of her back, then settled beside her as the engines powered up. He asked if she was nervous as Toronto fell away beneath them. She admitted she was terrified. She was going back to the place she fled from, trusting a man who kept me prisoner. She was hoping that a piece of paper was enough to make things different. He said the paper made it legally binding, but what made it real was both of them choosing to honor it. Adrian took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. He wouldn't lie and promise this would be easy. She would hate him sometimes. He'd frustrate her constantly. They'd fight about security and boundaries and 1,000 things he couldn't even predict yet, but he would try every day. He would try to be the partner she needed instead of the jailer he was. She replied that when he failed, because he would sometimes, she'd remind him of the contract. They'd fight about it, and they'd renegotiate. That's what constant negotiation meant. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. He said they'd figure this out, Eliza. Together, one impossible day at a time. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that this could actually work, that the man beside her could truly change enough to make partnership possible. But belief was complicated by experience. And experience had taught her that Adrian's promises came with asterisks and conditions. Still, as the plane climbed higher and Toronto disappeared into the darkness below, Eliza made herself a different promise. She would try, would honor the contract, give Adrian genuine chances to prove he could be different. But she would also stay vigilant, protect herself and her child, and be ready to fight for the boundaries they'd agreed to. Because partnership meant both of them trying, both of them compromising, both of them choosing each day to make this impossible thing work. And if it didn't, well, she'd run once. She could run again. But this time, at least, she'd run knowing she'd tried everything else first. The estate looked different in the pre-dawn darkness. It looked less like a palace and more like what it truly was. A fortress designed to keep the world out and its inhabitants in. As the car pulled through the security gates, Eliza felt her stomach tighten with a complicated mix of familiarity and dread. She'd spent 6 months here. She'd learned every corner of the grounds and memorized the patterns of guards and cameras. And then she'd escaped, convinced she'd never see these manicured gardens and stone walls again. Yet here she was, returning voluntarily, or as voluntarily as anything could be, when the alternative was a lifetime of running from a man who would always find her. Adrian's hand found hers in the darkness of the back seat. He said quietly, reading her tension, that it was still her home that hadn't changed. She thought everything had changed, but she didn't pull away from his touch. The contract sat in her bag, signed and witnessed. It was a legal promise that this time would be different. Whether that promise meant anything in practical terms remained to be seen. The car stopped at the main entrance, where Marcus Webb waited, with an expression that managed to convey both relief and apprehension. He opened Eliza's door himself, offering his hand to help her out. He greeted her formally. "Miss Hart, welcome back." She studied his face, searching for any sign of the man who'd helped her escape. She asked if he meant welcome home, or if they were pretending he wasn't complicit in her departure. Marcus's eyes flicked to Adrian, who'd come around the car to stand beside her. For a moment, the head of security looked genuinely uncertain, a rare expression on a man trained to handle any situation. Adrian said, his tone unreadable, that they would discuss Marcus's role in her adventure later. Right now, Eliza needed rest. It had been a long night, but Eliza wasn't ready to let it drop. She said helped her leave. He gave her the window, the codes, and probably covered for her those first few hours. She said if he was angry about that. Adrian's interruption was gentle but firm. He wasn't angry. Marcus did what he thought was right, protecting someone he believed was in danger. They would have a conversation about protocols and trust, but that was between him and Adrian, not something she needed to worry about. The easy dismissal irritated her. He risked his job, probably worse, to help her. That was absolutely something she should worry about. The contract said partnership. Adrian. That meant she got a say in what happened to people who helped her. Something shifted in Adrian's expression, surprise maybe, or approval. He studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. He said she was right. They'd discuss it together later, when she'd rested, and they could both think clearly. He asked if that was acceptable. It was a small concession, but it mattered. The old Adrian would have simply made decisions and informed her afterward. This version was actually asking, actually acknowledging her right to be part of the conversation. She agreed it was acceptable. Marcus looked between them with barely concealed confusion, clearly trying to understand the new dynamic, but he simply nodded and stepped back. He told her her rooms were ready, that he'd taken the liberty of having some items brought from her Toronto apartment. Personal things, books, the clothes she'd purchased. They were in her private quarters. Private quarters. The contract's language made real. Eliza felt another small knot of tension loosen. She thanked Marcus. Inside, the estate was exactly as she remembered. Polished marble floors. Artwork worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. The hushed elegance of wealth so profound, it didn't need to announce itself. But the woman who'd fled through service corridors 17 days ago was different from the one walking through the front door now. She had a contract, she had terms, she had the beginning of actual power in this relationship. Adrian guided her up the main staircase, past the master suite they'd shared before her escape, to a wing she'd barely explored during her previous residence. He stopped at a set of double doors and handed her a key. He said they were her private quarters, as specified in the contract. 3 rooms, a bedroom, sitting area, bathroom, with locks that only she had keys to. He'd instructed security that this space was off limits without her explicit permission. It was not monitored, not accessible to staff or himself. It was completely hers. Eliza took the key, its weight substantial in her palm. It was a simple thing, but symbolic of something larger. She unlocked the doors and stepped inside. The space was beautiful, decorated in soft grays and creams, with furniture that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. Large windows overlooked the gardens, though she noticed they were fitted with security glass and discreet sensors. Her books from Toronto were shelved by the window seat. Her few clothes hung in the closet beside new items still bearing tags. The bathroom held her preferred toiletries, arranged exactly as she'd kept them in her tiny Toronto apartment. Adrian said from the doorway, not crossing the threshold without invitation, that the nursery would be next door. He'd had designers draw up plans, but nothing had been decided. He thought they should choose together. Eliza struggled to process the consideration. It was so different from his previous assumption that he knew what she needed. She thanked him and said she'd like that. He said there was something else. He pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. It was the engagement ring she'd left behind. He'd had it reset with a different stone. The original was his grandmother's diamond, a Valente heirloom that came with expectations and history. He thought she might prefer something that was just theirs. He opened the box to reveal a ring that took her breath away. Still expensive, still beautiful, but different from the ostentatious 3-carat declaration he'd presented before. This was a deep blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, elegant without being overwhelming. He quietly said it was blue, like the dress she wore on their first real date. The one where she'd told him about wanting to finish her nursing degree, but being too buried in debt to consider it. He remembered thinking that night that he'd found someone who understood what it meant to want something desperately, but feel trapped by circumstances. Eliza stared at the ring, at this evidence that Adrian had been paying attention to more than just her movements and schedule. He'd remembered the color of a dress from months ago, understood the symbolism, and chosen something meaningful rather than merely expensive. He continued when she didn't respond. He said he didn't expect her to wear it right away. The contract said they'd marry within 3 months, before the baby started showing significantly. But when she was ready, when it felt right. The word came out before she'd fully processed the decision. Now. She'd wear it now. Not because she was ready for everything it represented, but because it was a symbol of what they were trying to build. Partnership, something new that was theirs, not his family's legacy or her desperate escape. Adrian's hands were surprisingly gentle as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the early morning light from the windows. For a moment they stood there, connected by this small circle of metal and stone. Both of them understanding it was a promise neither was entirely sure they could keep. Adrian finally said she should rest, stepping back toward the door. He had meetings most of the day, but dinner was at 7 if she'd like to join him. Or she could eat there in her quarters, her choice. The emphasis on choice wasn't subtle, but Eliza appreciated it anyway. She said she'd think about it. He paused at the threshold and said he was glad she came back. Even if she didn't fully believe it yet, even if this whole arrangement terrified her, he was glad. Then he was gone. The door closed softly behind him, leaving her alone in rooms that were supposed to represent freedom within captivity. Eliza sank onto the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The last 48 hours felt surreal. The roses at the cafe, the confrontation in Toronto, the contract and flight, and return to the estate. So much had changed, and yet the fundamental question remained unanswered. Could this actually work? Could she build a real partnership with a man who'd kept her prisoner? Could Adrian truly change enough to give her the space she needed? She looked at the sapphire on her finger, then at the key to her private quarters, then at the windows overlooking gardens she'd once viewed as the beautiful walls of her cage. Small concessions, symbolic gestures. But maybe that was how change happened. Not in dramatic transformations, but in tiny shifts that accumulated into something different. Sleep claimed her before she could pursue that thought further. When Eliza woke, afternoon sun slanted through the windows. Her phone, the burner from Toronto which she'd somehow managed to keep, showed 3 missed calls from Patricia and a text. Patricia was just checking she was alive and okay, and asked her to respond, so she knew she didn't need to call the police. Eliza texted back quickly that she was alive and okay. The situation was complicated, but she was safe, and she thanked Patricia for everything. The response came within seconds. If she needed out, she should call her, day or night. She meant it. Eliza smiled, despite the ache in her chest. She'd known Patricia for barely 2 weeks, but the cafe owner's fierce protectiveness felt more maternal than anything she'd experienced since her own mother died. She promised she would. Another text arrived, this one from an unknown number. It was from Marcus, saying Adrian had given him her new number. He wanted to apologize for any complications his assistance caused. He said if there was anything she needed, she shouldn't hesitate to ask. She stared at the message, understanding the subtext. Marcus was worried about his job, his future, possibly his life. Adrian's world didn't forgive disloyalty easily, and helping her escape had been a profound breach of trust. She typed back that they were meeting later to discuss it. She'd make sure Adrian understood he was trying to help someone in danger. She thanked him for giving her that chance, even though she ended up coming back anyway. No response came, but she hadn't really expected one. Marcus was too professional to continue a conversation that might be monitored. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Maria, who had brought lunch if she was hungry. Eliza recognized the voice, Maria Rodriguez, the head housekeeper. She was a woman in her 50s who'd always been kind during Eliza's previous residence. She opened the door to find Maria holding a tray, laden with food that smelled incredible. Maria said, Mr. Valente thought she might prefer eating in her rooms today, but he wanted to make sure she ate. The kitchen had prepared her favorites. Indeed, the tray held exactly what Eliza would have chosen. A Caesar salad, grilled chicken, fresh bread, and the chocolate mousse the estate's chef made perfectly. These were small details that showed Adrian was still tracking her preferences, but this time framing it as care rather than control. Eliza took the tray, then hesitated. She asked Maria if she could ask her something honestly. The housekeeper's expression became carefully neutral. Of course. Eliza asked what people had said when she left, when she ran. The staff, the security team, what did they think? Maria considered the question, clearly weighing loyalty to her employer against the genuine concern in Eliza's eyes. Finally, she sighed. She said there were two camps. Some thought she was foolish, running from the best situation she could hope for. Others thought she was brave, choosing freedom over comfort. Maria herself thought she was both. She also thought Mr. Valente was learning what everyone in his position must learn eventually, which is that you cannot keep something beautiful by putting it in a cage. Eventually, it either dies or finds a way to escape. Maria's eyes were sympathetic, but she also thought that Eliza would come back, because whatever else was true about Mr. Valente, he loved her in his way. And sometimes love was enough foundation to build something better, and if it wasn't, then she would leave again. But this time she'd know she tried everything possible first. Maria touched Eliza's arm gently. She told her to eat and rest, that the baby needed her to be strong, whatever she decided. After Maria left, Eliza ate mechanically, her mind churning through the housekeeper's words. Love was enough foundation to build something better. But what did love even mean in Adrian's context? He claimed to love her, but his version of love looked like possession, control, the need to own and protect in equal measure. Yet he'd also prepared a contract giving her unprecedented freedom. He'd chosen a ring that reflected actual attention to who she was rather than a generic display of wealth. He'd given her private quarters with locks he didn't have keys to. Small things, but they represented effort, change, the possibility that his love might evolve into something healthier. Her hand drifted to her stomach, feeling for the life growing there. This baby complicated everything, transforming a relationship problem into a lifelong connection. Regardless of what she decided about Adrian, they would be co-parents at a minimum. They would be bound together by a shared responsibility for another human being. The question was whether they could be more than that, whether partnership was actually possible, or just a pleasant fiction that would crumble under the weight of Adrian's need for control. The afternoon passed slowly. Eliza explored her new quarters thoroughly, testing boundaries. The locks worked perfectly. The windows opened, though only a few inches, and she noticed sensors that would alert security if they were forced wider. A laptop sat on the desk, and when she opened it, she found it had unrestricted internet access. No parental controls, no blocked sites, no obvious monitoring software. She tested it carefully, searching for news about Adrian's organization, reading articles about him that ranged from society page puff pieces to darker investigations into his business practices. The computer didn't block anything, didn't flag her searches. Either Adrian was genuinely giving her access to information, or he was confident enough in his position that her knowledge didn't threaten him. Probably both. At 6:30, another knock. This time it was Daniel Park, Adrian's senior security officer, looking uncomfortable. He told Miss Hart that Mr. Valente had asked him to remind her about dinner at 7 if she was inclined to join him. But he also said to emphasize that it was completely her choice. He'd eat in the main dining room regardless. The phrasing was so carefully neutral. It was almost funny. She told him she'd be there. He said of course, and added that it was good to have her back, that the house felt wrong without her. Before she could respond to that unexpected admission, Daniel was gone. Eliza changed into one of the new dresses hanging in her closet. It was simple, elegant, appropriate for dinner without being formal. She left her hair loose and applied minimal makeup, then studied herself in the mirror. The sapphire engagement ring caught the light, a constant reminder of promises made and uncertainties ahead. She looked like someone playing a role. Adrian Valente's fiancée, future mother of his child, a partner in an arrangement that sounded reasonable on paper, but had yet to be tested in reality. The main dining room was on the first floor, overlooking the gardens through floor-to-ceiling windows. Adrian was already there, standing by those windows with a whiskey in hand, silhouetted against the dying light. He turned when she entered, and something in his expression shifted. Warmth, relief, genuine pleasure at seeing her. He said he wasn't sure she would come. She replied that she'd said she'd try, and this was trying. Eliza sat as a staff member poured her water. Pregnancy meant no wine, no whiskey, just sparkling water and the hyper-awareness of every substance entering her body. Adrian took a seat across from her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Two people who'd shared a bed and intimacy, but were still fundamentally strangers in the ways that mattered. The table between them was set with china and crystal, the kind of formal elegance Adrian's world demanded, even for a private dinner. He asked how she was feeling, the pregnancy. He meant any morning sickness or complications. She replied that she had some nausea in the mornings, but nothing terrible. She'd spread her napkin across her lap. She had seen a doctor in Toronto, Dr. Singh, who said everything looked normal for 13 weeks. He said he'd like to bring in his doctors, the best maternal-fetal specialists in the country. Not because he didn't trust her, Dr. Singh, but the words came out sharper than she'd intended. Was it because he needed to control every aspect of this pregnancy? Adrian's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. He said it was because the thought of anything going wrong, of losing her or the baby due to something preventable, was intolerable. But she was right that it came from the same impulse as everything else, his need to control, to ensure outcomes, to eliminate risk. So, he was asking instead of telling. He asked if she would see his doctors and let them monitor the pregnancies alongside whomever she preferred. The fact that he'd caught himself, acknowledged the controlling impulse, and tried to reframe it as a request was notable. She said she'd see his doctors, but she also wanted to keep Dr. Singh. She hadn't asked questions she couldn't answer, and she'd treated her like a person, not a problem to be managed. He said that was fair enough, and he'd have his team coordinate with her office. He paused as staff brought the first course, a delicate soup that smelled of herbs and cream. He also wanted to discuss the wedding timeline. The contract specified within 3 months, but the actual date was flexible. He asked what would work for her. Eliza tasted the soup, buying time to think. She didn't want a huge society wedding. No press, no hundreds of guests, no circus. He agreed. He was thinking small, immediate family only, or what passed for family in his world. His uncle and cousins, a few trusted associates, maybe 30 people total, a private ceremony in the estate gardens, with a reception in the ballroom. Simple but elegant. She met his eyes and said on her side she didn't have much family. A few cousins she hadn't spoken to in years. Some friends from her old life who probably thought she disappeared into witness protection, or worse. He told her to invite whoever she wanted, whoever mattered to her. They could tell them whatever story she was comfortable with, that they'd been dating privately, that the pregnancy was unexpected but welcome, that they were happy. The truth was too complicated for most people anyway. The truth was too complicated even for them. Eliza ate slowly, considering 8 weeks from now. That would give her time to adjust, to see if this partnership thing was actually working before they made it permanent. He agreed to 8 weeks and said he'd have his people start planning. His voice was careful, controlled, but she caught the flash of something raw in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or fear that 8 weeks wouldn't be enough to prove himself. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that felt less awkward than it should have. Finally, Adrian spoke again. He mentioned she'd asked about Marcus earlier, about what would happen to him for helping her escape. She said she did, and she meant it, if he was going to punish him. Adrian's interruption was gentle. He wasn't. Marcus did what he thought was right, protecting someone he believed was in danger. That showed integrity and moral courage, qualities he valued, even when they were inconvenient for him. They had a conversation this afternoon. He made it clear that while he didn't appreciate the breach of protocol, he understood his reasoning. Marcus would remain head of household security. Eliza set down her fork. Just like that, he wasn't angry? Adrian's smile was tight. He was furious. He helped her leave, put her at risk by sending her out into the world without proper protection, and forced him to confront the fact that his own security team believed she needed rescuing from him. Of course, he was angry, but anger and action were separate things. Marcus was valuable, trustworthy, and he genuinely cared about the people under his protection. Those qualities were rare. He wasn't going to lose him over one decision he disagreed with. Eliza struggled to articulate her surprise. That was mature of him. He told her not to sound so shocked. He was capable of rational decision-making even when emotions were involved. Besides, the contract said partnership. She'd made it clear that Marcus's fate mattered to her. So it mattered to him because she mattered to him. That's how this worked, right? Her concerns became his, in theory. She studied him across the table, trying to reconcile this thoughtful, compromising version of Adrian with the man who'd controlled every aspect of her previous life. She said it was going to take her a while to trust this, to believe he was actually changing, and not just performing change, until she was committed enough that he could revert to old patterns. Adrian's voice was quiet. He knew, and that was fair. He'd spent 6 months training her to expect control and restriction. It would take longer than a few days to undo that conditioning. All he could do was show her consistently that he was trying and hope that eventually the evidence outweighed her reasonable skepticism. The main course arrived. Perfectly cooked salmon with roasted vegetables, plated like art. Eliza ate mechanically, her mind elsewhere. This version of Adrian was harder to resist than the controlling one. The man who admitted his anger but chose not to act on it. The man who acknowledged her skepticism as reasonable and who framed their partnership as something he had to earn rather than something owed to him. That man was dangerous to her carefully maintained emotional distance. Adrian said suddenly to tell him about her day. What did she do after she woke up? Such a normal question. The kind couples asked each other over dinner, sharing the mundane details of separate lives. She said she slept until afternoon, texted Patricia to let her know she was okay, ate lunch in her rooms, explored the quarters, tested the internet access, and read some articles about him that painted him as everything from a philanthropist to a monster. He asked which articles she believed. The ones that said he was both. She met his eyes. He wasn't a simple villain. He did terrible things for complex reasons. He'd built an empire on activities that hurt people, but he also used that wealth to fund hospitals and scholarships. He was ruthless in business, but gentle with her when he thought she wasn't watching. The contradictions made him harder to hate than she'd like. He asked if it would be easier if he were purely monstrous. She managed a small smile, much easier. Black and white morality was simpler than navigating all this gray area. He welcomed her to his world. Nothing was ever simple. Every decision had consequences that rippled in directions you couldn't predict, and the only certainty was that someone would judge you for whatever choice you made. Adrian's voice held a weariness she'd never heard before. He'd stopped trying to be good years ago. Now he just tried to be effective, and hoped that the good he did balanced some of the harm she asked if it did. He said he had no idea, and told her to ask him again in 20 years when they could look back and see what kind of world they'd built for their child. Their child. The casual possessiveness in those words should have irritated her, but instead, Eliza felt something else. A kind of tentative hope that maybe, possibly, they could actually build something functional out of this mess. Not love in the traditional sense, that might never be possible given how they'd started. But partnership, mutual respect, and co-parenting that gave their child stability, even if the parents' relationship remained complicated. Dessert was the chocolate mousse she'd had at lunch, and Eliza ate it slowly, savoring the rich sweetness. Across from her, Adrian watched with an expression that might have been contentment if she believed he was capable of such simple emotions. When they'd both finished, he said he'd like to show her something. If she was willing, it required going to his office, which he knew was asking her to enter his space. She interrupted, surprising them both, and said she'd go. Eliza was curious what Adrian wanted to show her, what required his private office, rather than the neutral ground of the dining room. They walked through quiet hallways together, past staff who nodded respectfully, and security who tracked their movement with professional detachment. Adrian's office was in the West Wing, a room Eliza had never been invited to before. He unlocked it and gestured her inside. The space was exactly what she'd expected. Dark wood furniture, leather chairs, walls lined with books, and what she suspected were hidden safes. But what caught her attention was the architect's model dominating the center of his desk. Adrian explained this was the nursery, moving to stand beside it. There were 3 different design options. He wanted her input before they proceeded with any of them. The models were exquisite, each showing a different vision of their child's future room. One was traditional, with white furniture, soft colors, and classic decorations. Another was modern, with clean lines, minimalist design and neutral tones. The third was whimsical, with hand-painted murals, creative storage, and a space that encouraged imagination. Eliza admitted she didn't know anything about babies and asked which one was best. Adrian's voice was gentle. He said that wasn't the right question. The question was which one felt right to her. This was her child's space, her vision of what their early years should look like. He could provide resources and implementation, but the direction needed to come from her. The trust implicit in that statement was staggering. He was giving her control over something that mattered, letting her shape their child's environment without his input. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of their complicated relationship, but it felt like another brick in the foundation of actual partnership. She finally said the whimsical one. She wanted their baby to grow up with color and creativity, to see their room as a place of joy, not just expensive furniture. She asked if that was okay. Adrian's smile was genuine, more than okay. He'd have the designer start tomorrow, and he told her she could change her mind at any point. This wasn't a binding decision. If she saw something she didn't like as it came together, they would adjust. This was a collaboration. She believed him. Against all her careful skepticism, all her knowledge of who Adrian Valente was capable of being, she believed that in this moment, he genuinely wanted her input and would honor her choices. It was terrifying how much she wanted to trust that this was real and not a sophisticated manipulation. They stood together looking at the models. For the first time since returning to the estate, Eliza allowed herself to imagine a future here that wasn't entirely grim, a nursery filled with color and laughter. A child who grew up knowing both parents, who benefited from Adrian's resources without being crushed by his expectations. A partnership that evolved from contractual obligation into something approaching genuine connection. It was a fragile hope, easily shattered, but it was hope nonetheless. And after weeks of running and fear, and the grinding exhaustion of trying to survive alone, hope felt like oxygen after drowning. She said quietly, "Thank you for trying, for all of this." She knew it wasn't easy for him to give up control. Adrian's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was becoming familiar. He said nothing worth having was easy, but she was worth the difficulty. This, he gestured at the space between them. The tentative connection they were building was worth learning to be different. They stood like that for a long moment, hands linked, studying the tiny models that represented hope for a future neither of them could quite envision yet. Outside the office windows, darkness had fully claimed the estate grounds, transforming the gardens into shadows and dim security lights. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of whether Adrian could truly sustain this version of himself, or if old patterns would reassert themselves. But tonight, in the quiet of his office with architectural dreams spread before them, it was enough to simply stand together and imagine possibilities. That was the thing about partnership, Eliza was learning. It wasn't built in grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was constructed in small moments, a contract honored, a choice respected, a vision shared. Brick by tiny brick, conversation by difficult conversation, compromise by uncomfortable compromise. Whether they could sustain it remained the great unknown, but at least now they were both trying. The fragile hope that had taken root in Adrian's office sustained Eliza through the next 2 weeks. Though it was tested daily in ways both subtle and profound, she learned that partnership with Adrian Valente meant constant negotiation, a delicate dance between his instinct for control and her need for autonomy. Some days the balance held, other days it fractured. The arguments that followed left her questioning whether the contract was worth the paper it was printed on. The first real fight came on a Tuesday morning. Eliza discovered that Adrian had assigned a full security detail to accompany her prenatal appointment without consulting her first. She'd walked downstairs ready to meet the car Adrian had arranged, only to find Daniel and 3 other armed guards waiting in the foyer. The rage had been instantaneous and incandescent. She gestured at the small army, assembled to escort her to a doctor's appointment, and asked what this was. Daniel had looked uncomfortable. He said it was standard security protocol for off-estate movements, and that Mr. Valente was quite clear about the requirements. It wasn't a question. Eliza had turned on her heel and marched straight to Adrian's office. She didn't bother to knock before throwing open the door. He'd been on a phone call, but one look at her face had him ending it abruptly. He started to say her name, but she cut him off, asking if he was insane for sending 4 guards for a prenatal appointment. Adrian had stood slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to that carefully controlled neutrality that meant he knew he'd overstepped. He said it was a necessary precaution. She was carrying his child, and every enemy he had would see her as a target. She crossed her arms and said they should have discussed this in advance and agreed on appropriate security measures. Oh wait, they didn't, because he made a unilateral decision about her safety without consulting her, which violated the contract, specifically Section 3, Paragraph 2, regarding joint decision-making for matters affecting her daily life. The fact that she'd memorized the relevant sections had clearly surprised him. Adrian had been quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. He was clearly wrestling with instincts that screamed at him to simply impose his will. Finally, he'd exhaled slowly. He said she was right, he should have discussed it with her first. But Eliza, the threat was real. A woman connected to the Kozlov organization was kidnapped last month. They held her for ransom, and when her husband couldn't meet their demands fast enough, he stopped, his face going hard. He couldn't let that happen to her. He wouldn't. She'd softened slightly, seeing the genuine fear beneath his controlling impulse. She said they should discuss it, assess the actual threat level together, and decide on security that kept her safe without making her feel like a prisoner. She wasn't asking him to leave her unprotected. She was asking him to include her in decisions about her own life. They'd compromised. 2 guards instead of 4, both in plain clothes rather than the obvious military bearing Daniel and his team projected. A panic button was installed on her phone, and they agreed on specific protocols together rather than having rules imposed from above. It had been exhausting, but it had also been partnership in action. Conflict, negotiation, compromise. Neither of them was entirely happy with the outcome, but both felt heard. The pattern repeated itself over and over. Adrian would make an assumption about what Eliza needed. She would push back. They would fight and eventually find middle ground. It was progress, she supposed, though some days it felt more like trench warfare than relationship building. But there were good moments too. Quiet evenings when they'd sit in the library, and Adrian would read aloud from books about pregnancy and infant care. His voice would stumble over unfamiliar terminology in a way that was oddly endearing. Mornings when she'd wake to find he'd already arranged her favorite breakfast. Not because he was controlling her diet, but because he'd noticed she was struggling with morning sickness and wanted to help. The nursery construction became a touchstone for their evolving dynamic. True to his word, Adrian gave Eliza complete creative control while providing unlimited resources to implement her vision. She'd worked with the designers daily, choosing paint colors and furniture, debating the merits of different cribs and changing tables. Adrian would appear occasionally to check progress, but he never overruled her choices or imposed his preferences. One afternoon, standing in the nearly complete space, he'd said it was perfect. The walls were painted in soft sage green with hand-painted white clouds. A reading nook nestled by the window, filled with books for every age. The crib was elegant but sturdy, surrounded by whimsical artwork that depicted forests and friendly animals. Eliza had touched them while hanging above the crib, hand-carved wooden birds that spun gently in the air currents. She asked if he really thought so, if it wasn't too much. He said it was exactly right. A space for their child to feel safe and loved and free to imagine. He'd moved closer, placing his hand over hers on the mobile. He said she was going to be an incredible mother. The certainty in his voice had made her throat tight. She said he didn't know that she didn't know the first thing about raising a child. He said neither did he, but he knew her. He'd watched her care about people. Patricia at the cafe, the other waitresses at Romano's, even Marcus, despite the professional boundaries. She had a capacity for nurturing that he'd never possessed. Their child was lucky to have her. It was moments like that, genuine, vulnerable, stripped of Adrian's usual armor, that made Eliza question her own emotional defenses. She'd spent weeks telling herself this was a practical arrangement, a partnership built on contract rather than feeling. But the truth was more complicated. She was starting to care about Adrian in ways that went beyond co-parenting necessity. She was starting to see the man he might have been if he'd been born into different circumstances. The version of himself he was trying to become for her and their child. It was terrifying. The wedding planning forced them into even closer collaboration. True to their agreement, they kept it small, just 30 guests in the estate gardens on a Saturday afternoon, 6 weeks after Eliza's return. She'd chosen a simple dress, elegant ivory silk that accommodated her growing belly without advertising the pregnancy. No veil, no train, nothing that screamed traditional bride. Just her, a dress, and the sapphire engagement ring that had started to feel natural on her finger. The night before the wedding, Eliza stood at the window of her private quarters, watching security lights patrol the grounds. Tomorrow, she would marry Adrian Valente. She would legally bind herself to a man who'd been both her captor and her lover, a man who represented everything dangerous and everything she'd somehow come to need. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She opened it to find not Adrian. They'd agreed to spend the night apart, one small nod to tradition. But Marcus, holding a small envelope. He said it had arrived for her. A courier delivered it to the gate with specific instructions that it was for her eyes only. Eliza took the envelope with trembling fingers. Her name was written in handwriting she didn't recognize. No return address, just her name and the estate's address. Inside was a single photograph and a note written in block letters. It said he'll never change. Ask him about Elena Rostova. Save yourself while you still can. The photograph showed Adrian, younger, maybe 5 years ago, standing with a beautiful dark-haired woman. They were laughing together, his arm around her waist, both looking genuinely happy. On the back, someone had written, Elena Rostova, missing since 2021, last seen entering the Valente estate. Eliza's blood turned to ice. Elena Rostova, missing since 2021, last seen with Adrian. Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. He asked if she was all right, that she'd gone pale. She forced the words through numb lips and asked who delivered it. He said it was an anonymous courier service. A young kid on a bike, paid cash, gave no name. He could try to track him. Eliza closed the envelope quickly and said no. It was nothing, just a friend sending congratulations. She thanked Marcus. He didn't believe her. She could see the concern in his eyes, but he nodded and left. Alone again, Eliza stared at the photograph, her mind racing. Who was Elena Rostova? What had happened to her? And why was someone warning Eliza about her the night before the wedding? She could confront Adrian directly, demand answers. But what if the answers confirmed her worst fears? What if the man she was preparing to marry tomorrow had actually harmed this woman? What if all his promises of change were just sophisticated manipulation? Or this could be a manipulation itself. Someone trying to sabotage the wedding, plant doubt, and destroy the fragile trust she and Adrian had been building. His enemies would certainly have motivation to prevent their marriage, to eliminate any potential heirs or alliances. Eliza paced her rooms for hours, the photograph burning in her hands, trying to decide what to do. By 3 a.m, she'd made her choice. She would ask Adrian about Elena Rostova. Not tomorrow, not during the wedding, but soon. And his answer would determine whether this partnership had any real foundation or if she was building her future on lies. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, as if someone had ordered perfect weather from a catalog. Eliza dressed mechanically, letting the stylist Adrian had hired arrange her hair and apply minimal makeup. In the mirror, she looked like a bride, polished, elegant, appropriately radiant. But inside, questions about Elena Rostova gnawed at her composure. Maria appeared as the stylist finished, carrying something wrapped in tissue paper. She said Mr. Valente had asked her to give it to Eliza. He said it belonged to his mother. Inside the tissue was a delicate pearl necklace, clearly vintage, beautiful in its simplicity. A note in Adrian's handwriting accompanied it. It said his mother wore this on her wedding day. She would have liked Eliza, would have approved of someone willing to challenge him rather than simply submit. He told her to wear it if she wanted, or leave it if she didn't. Today was about them choosing each other freely and honestly. The note made her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed, freely and honestly. But how could anything be honest when she was hiding a photograph, and he might be hiding a missing woman? Still, she put on the necklace. Whatever else was true, she was walking into this with open eyes, and she would get answers. The ceremony took place in the Rose Garden exactly as planned. 30 guests, Adrian's uncle Vincent, various cousins and business associates, Marcus and Daniel representing the security team, Maria and key staff members. On Eliza's side, Patricia had flown in from Toronto along with 2 former co-workers from Romano's who'd been shocked and delighted to discover she was alive and getting married. Adrian stood at the makeshift altar in a perfectly tailored suit. He looked impossibly handsome and dangerously powerful. When Eliza walked toward him, his expression transformed. All his careful control dropped away to reveal something raw and real. Hope, fear, a vulnerability she'd never foreseen him show in public. The officiant kept it brief. No lengthy speeches about love conquering all or two souls becoming one. Just the essential words, the binding promises, the exchange of rings. When Adrian slid the wedding band onto her finger, white gold to match the sapphire engagement ring, his hands shook slightly. He said quietly, off script, meant only for her ears, that he promised to try every day to be the partner she deserved instead of the jailer he was. Eliza replied equally quiet, that she promised to stay, to fight for this instead of running. She promised to believe that people can change if they want it badly enough. The officiant said he could kiss the bride. Adrian's kiss was gentle, reverent, nothing like the passionate claims she'd experienced before. This was a promise made physical, a promise that said, I see you, I choose you, I will try to be worthy of you. The reception was elegant and subdued, more dinner party than wild celebration. Eliza moved through it in a daze, accepting congratulations, making small talk with Adrian's relatives, who studied her with frank curiosity. They said she was the woman who'd tamed Adrian Valente, the one who'd made him sign a contract limiting his own power. They didn't know whether to admire her courage or pity her naivete. Patricia cornered her during dinner, pulling her aside with the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear. She asked if she was sure about this, that it wasn't too late to run. She had a car waiting, they could be across the border before. Eliza squeezed her hand and said she was sure, or as sure as she could be about anything. He was trying, really trying, and she owed it to their baby to see if this could work. And if it didn't, then she'd have the best divorce attorney in the country on speed dial. She managed to smile. The contract protected her legally, and she wasn't the same woman who ran from here weeks ago. She was stronger now, more certain of what she would and wouldn't accept. Patricia didn't look convinced, but she nodded. She told Eliza to call her anytime, day or night. If she needed out, if things went wrong, she should call. Eliza promised she would. As the sun set and guests began departing, Eliza found herself alone with Adrian on the terrace, watching the last light fade from the sky. They had danced once during the reception, a slow, careful dance that felt more like negotiation than celebration. Now they stood in comfortable silence, both processing the fact that they were actually married. Adrian finally asked if she was glad that she stayed, that they did this. Eliza touched the photograph hidden in her dress pocket. She'd transferred it there, unable to leave it behind. She told him to ask her again in a year when they'd had more time to see if the partnership actually worked. He said that was fair enough. He pulled her closer, one arm around her waist, protective without being possessive. He meant what he said during the ceremony. He would try every single day. Even when it was hard, even when his instincts screamed at him to control and protect and own, he'd try to be different. She said she knew he would. She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. But she needed to ask him something, and she needed him to be completely honest with her. His body tensed slightly. He asked what it was. She asked, "Who is Elena Rostova?" The change was immediate and dramatic. Adrian went rigid, his arm dropping from her waist. His face shut down into the cold mask he wore for dangerous negotiations. He asked where she heard that name. She told him to answer the question. Eliza pulled out the photograph, handing it to him. She said someone sent it to her last night. It said she went missing in 2021, last seen entering his estate. So, she was asking him directly, who was she and what happened to her? Adrian stared at the photograph for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Elena Rostova was someone he knew 5 years ago, someone he cared about. And yes, she disappeared. But not the way whoever sent her this was implying. She told him to explain it to her, to make her understand. He asked if they could go inside, that this wasn't a conversation for the garden. They walked in tense silence to Adrian's office. It was the same room where they'd looked at nursery plans and imagined their future. But now the atmosphere was different, charged with suspicion and fear, and the possibility that everything they'd built was about to crumble. Adrian poured himself a whiskey and drank half of it before speaking. Elena was an attorney, brilliant, principled, completely committed to justice. She was prosecuting members of the Kozlov Organization for human trafficking, and her case was airtight. They would have gone to prison for decades. Eliza asked what this had to do with him. The Kozlovs came to him, asked him to make her disappear, and offered substantial compensation for eliminating their problem. Adrian's voice was flat, emotionless. He refused. Despite what she might think of him, he didn't kill innocent people doing their jobs. But he knew the Kozlovs wouldn't accept his refusal. They'd just hire someone else, someone less scrupulous. So what did he do? He went to Elena, told her about the contract on her life, and offered her a choice. He could provide new identity documents, enough money to disappear completely, and guarantee her safety if she was willing to walk away from the case and her old life. Or he could provide security while she finished the prosecution, knowing the Kozlovs would eventually find a way past any protection he could offer. Eliza's heart was pounding. She asked what Elena chose. She wanted to finish the case. She said those women deserved justice, that she couldn't live with herself if she ran. Adrian's expression was bleak, so he gave her the best security he could arrange. Round-the-clock protection, safe houses, the works. For 3 months it held. Then the Kozlovs got creative. They didn't come after her directly. They went after her younger sister, 16 years old, grabbed her off the street on her way home from school. His voice cracked slightly. The message was clear. Drop the case or watch her sister die slowly. So, Elena disappeared to protect her sister. Understanding was starting to dawn. He gave her everything she needed to vanish completely. A new identity, a new life in a place the Kozlovs would never find her. The sister was returned unharmed once Elena was confirmed gone, and the case fell apart without her testimony. Adrian finished his whiskey. He said she was alive, living in New Zealand under the name Emma Chen, working as a corporate attorney, completely safe. He still got updates occasionally to make sure she was protected. That photograph was taken the day before she left, when she came to thank him for saving her life. Eliza stared at him, trying to process the story, to determine if it was truth or elaborate fiction. She asked if he had proof that she was alive and safe. He said he could have proof in her hands within an hour. Phone records, photographs, verification from his people in New Zealand. Whatever she needed to believe him. His eyes were desperate. He knew how this looked. He knew someone sent her that photograph specifically to make her think he'd harmed her, but he didn't. He saved her life, just like he saved hers from those men who followed her home from Romano's. The parallel wasn't lost on her. Both times, Adrian had used his resources and power to protect rather than harm. But the fact that he had kept Elena's story from her, that she'd had to confront him with evidence rather than him volunteering the information, rankled. She asked why he hadn't told her about Elena before, if this was as innocent as he said. He said it wasn't relevant. Elena was 5 years ago, long before he met her. It was a professional favor that turned into something more personal because it respected what she was trying to do. Adrian moved closer. But he said she was right that he should have told her, should have been transparent about his past, about the women he'd known and helped and cared about. He didn't want her thinking about all the people who came before her when they were trying to build something new. It was a reasonable explanation. But the timing of the photograph, arriving the night before the wedding, suggested someone knew exactly how to plant doubt. Someone wanted her to question Adrian, to potentially call off the marriage. She held up the photograph and asked who would have sent this. Who benefited from her doubting him? Adrian's voice turned grim. Half the families he did business with. Their marriage created complications for several ongoing negotiations. The Kozlovs particularly would love to see it fail. They'd been trying to expand into his territory for years, and a stable personal life made him harder to manipulate or distract. This photograph was exactly the kind of psychological warfare they specialized in. So this was a test. Eliza felt anger rising. Someone testing whether she'd trust him or run at the first suggestion of darkness in his past. Adrian's expression softened. A test she passed by confronting him directly instead of simply fleeing. She demanded truth, made him explain himself. Exactly what a real partner would do, instead of a captive too afraid to question. He was right. The old Eliza, the one who'd lived at the estate before, would never have dared confront Adrian about something like this. She would have either run or swallowed her suspicion silently. But the woman she'd become, The one who'd survived Toronto, negotiated a contract, and insisted on partnership. That woman demanded answers. She said firmly that she wanted that proof, the verification that Elena Rostova was alive and well in New Zealand. Not because she didn't believe him, but because trust requires evidence, especially when someone was actively trying to undermine it. Adrian pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. He said she'd have it within the hour. He was also going to find out who sent that photograph, and when he did, Eliza interrupted. When he did, they would discuss it together before he took action. That's what partnership meant. He didn't just unleash retribution without consulting her first. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. Agreed. They would discuss it together, decide together how to respond. An hour later, sitting in Adrian's office with a laptop open between them, Eliza watched video footage of a woman who was unmistakably Elena Rostova walking into a law office in Auckland. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. Adrian's contact in New Zealand had also provided phone records, showing regular contact between Elena as a secured number that Adrian confirmed was his emergency line for protected persons. Eliza felt the knot in her chest finally loosen. She was alive. He really did save her. Adrian's voice was quiet. He told her he didn't kill innocent people. He'd done terrible things, and he wouldn't lie about that. But protecting people who deserved protection, using his power for something other than personal gain, that was the line he'd tried to maintain. It wasn't much of a moral high ground, but it was something. She studied him in the lamplight, this complicated man who'd become her husband. He was right that his moral high ground was questionable at best. But the fact that he had lines at all, that he'd risked significant business complications to save Elena Rostova's life, suggested he wasn't the pure monster someone wanted her to believe he was. She finally said thank you for telling her the truth and for providing proof. That mattered. Partnership required honesty, even when the truth was complicated. Adrian closed the laptop. He asked if there was anything else she wanted to know about his past, about the people he'd known, about decisions he'd made. He told her to ask now, to get everything out in the open. It was a genuine offer, she could tell. A chance to excavate all his secrets, to understand exactly who she'd married. Part of her wanted to take him up on it, to demand a full accounting of every questionable choice and dark alliance. But another part recognized that some truths were better discovered gradually as they became relevant, rather than dumped all at once in a way that might be overwhelming. She said carefully that she was sure there would be more questions as they came up, but for tonight, this was enough. He'd shown her that when she confronted him with concerns, he responded with honesty and evidence. That's what she needed to know right now. Adrian's relief was palpable. He asked if they could go back to being newlyweds, at least for the rest of tonight. Tomorrow they could return to navigating all the complications, but tonight they could just be us. Eliza stood, offering her hand. She said, "Come on, it was their wedding night. They should at least pretend to enjoy it." His laugh was surprised and genuine. Pretend? Well, she was 4 months pregnant, exhausted from the wedding, and she'd just spent 2 hours thinking he might be a murderer. So yes, they might have to pretend a little. Fair enough. But when Adrian took her hand and pulled her close, when he kissed her with a gentleness that acknowledged everything they'd been through and everything they were trying to build, there was no pretending necessary. They were partners now, legally bound, emotionally complicated, and committed to figuring out how to make this impossible thing work. It wasn't the fairy tale wedding night most brides dreamed of, but it was real and honest, and somehow that mattered more than any fantasy. Later, lying beside Adrian in the darkness of his bedroom, she'd agreed to spend their wedding night together, a concession to tradition and genuine desire. Eliza felt the baby move for the first time, a tiny flutter, barely perceptible, but unmistakably there. She grabbed his hand, pressing it to her stomach, and asked if he felt that. He went still, concentrating. Then his eyes widened as the movement came again. He asked if that was the baby. She said it was the first time she'd felt actual movement. The expression on Adrian's face was something she'd never seen before. Pure wonder, stripped of all his usual control and calculation. He said their child was actually real, actually alive in there. Very real, very alive, and very likely to make their lives infinitely more complicated than they already were. Adrian's voice was thick with emotion. He couldn't wait. He knew that was insane given everything they were still figuring out, But he genuinely couldn't wait to meet this person, to see what combination of her and him they turned out to be. Eliza thought about the contract clause they'd negotiated, the promise that their child would have the freedom to choose their own path. They were going to be so loved. Whatever else happened, whatever complications they faced, they'd be loved. Adrian's hand remained on her stomach, feeling for more movement. He promised they'd be loved and protected, and free to become whoever they wanted to be. As sleep finally claimed her, Eliza's last conscious thought was that partnership was messy and difficult and required constant vigilance. But lying there with Adrian's hand on her growing belly, feeling their child move between them, she thought maybe it was also worth every complicated moment. The photograph of Elena Rostova remained in her nightstand drawer, not forgotten, but filed away as evidence that when tested, Adrian had chosen truth over evasion. It was a small thing, but small things accumulated into foundations, and foundations supported everything that came after. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new chances for Adrian to prove himself or revert to old patterns, new opportunities for her to choose trust or retreat into protective skepticism. But tonight, they'd passed one test together, and that was enough to build on. The foundation they'd built on their wedding night would be tested sooner than either of them expected. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, when Eliza was 20 weeks pregnant and finally starting to believe the partnership might actually survive, everything nearly fell apart. She woke to find Adrian's side of the bed empty and cold. This wasn't unusual. He often rose early for business calls with contacts in different time zones. But something felt wrong. The air in the bedroom carried a tension she'd learned to recognize. The electric charge that preceded violence in Adrian's world. Eliza dressed quickly and found Marcus waiting outside her door, his expression grim. He told Mrs. Valente that there had been a situation. Mr. Valente was handling it, and she was to remain in her quarters until further notice. The old commands, issued without consultation. Eliza felt her spine stiffen. She asked what kind of situation. He said he wasn't at liberty to say, but he was very clear that her safety required it. She demanded to know where he was. The security chief hesitated, clearly torn between orders and the partnership contract he knew existed. He said the West Wing conference room, but that Mr. Valente specifically said. She cut him off. She was going to see her husband. He could either escort her or follow her, but she was going. She moved past him before he could object further. The West Wing conference room was one Eliza had never entered before. It was deep in the parts of the estate where Adrian conducted his actual business, rather than the sanitized version he'd tried to keep her separate from. 2 guards stood outside the door, and she could hear raised voices from within. Adrian's controlled fury and another man's desperate pleading. She told the guards to let her through. They exchanged uncertain glances. They said Mr. Valente gave strict orders. She replied that she was his wife. She outranked his orders. It was a gamble, testing whether the contract actually gave her authority, or if Adrian's words still superseded everything. She told them to open the door. After a moment's hesitation, they did. The scene inside stopped Eliza cold. Adrian stood over a man bound to a chair, blood trickling from the captive's split lip. Daniel and 2 other security team members flanked the prisoner, their expressions professionally blank. The walls were covered with photographs and documents, surveillance images, financial records, and what looked like intercepted communications. Adrian turned when the door opened, his face transitioning rapidly from cold fury to shock to something that might have been fear. He told her she shouldn't be here. She kept her voice steady, despite the racing of her heart. She said Marcus told her there was a situation, and asked what was going on. The man in the chair looked up, and Eliza recognized him with a jolt. Viktor Kozlov, one of the mid-level operators in the organization that had sent Elena Rostova the death threat years ago. She'd seen his photograph in the documents Adrian had shown her. She'd memorized his face as one of the people who represented a genuine danger to their family. Adrian said, his voice carefully controlled, that they caught him on the grounds. He'd breached security at 3 this morning. He had a weapon, surveillance equipment, and this. He held up a small vial filled with a clear liquid, enough poison to contaminate the entire water supply. He was targeting her specifically, her private quarters, the nursery plumbing. He was going to kill her and their child slowly, and make it look like pregnancy complications. The room tilted. Eliza grabbed the door frame for support, her free hand instinctively moving to her stomach. He was going to poison her. Adrian's voice was ice. The Kozlovs had been trying to undermine him for months. First, the photograph of Elena, trying to destroy their marriage before it solidified. When that failed, they escalated. Victor here was quite informative once they explained his options. The plan was to eliminate her and the baby, destabilize him emotionally, and create an opening for them to move on his territory while he was grieving and distracted. Victor spat blood onto the floor. He said, "You think you're untouchable, Valente? You think marrying some waitress and playing house makes you something other than what you are? You're a monster, and eventually someone will put you down." Adrian's fist connected with Victor's jaw before he could finish the sentence. The sound of impact was sickening. He said, "You came onto my property, threatened my wife, plotted to murder my unborn child, and you think you have standing to lecture me about morality." Eliza's voice cut through the violence. "Adrian, stop." He froze, his fist raised for another blow. Every muscle in his body was coiled with rage. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, with a visible effort, he lowered his hand and stepped back from the prisoner. Eliza said quietly for everyone to get out except Adrian and Victor. "Now." Daniel looked at Adrian, clearly seeking confirmation. Adrian nodded sharply, and the security team filed out. Marcus was the last to leave, his expression troubled as he closed the door behind him. Alone with the two men, Eliza moved closer to Victor, studying him. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with the desperate eyes of someone who'd already accepted he was going to die. She asked what the Kozlovs were offering him. What was worth risking his life to come here? Victor laughed bitterly. He said, "You think he had a choice?" His sister owed them money, gambling debts she couldn't pay. They said if he did this job, her debt would be cleared, and she'd be safe. If he refused, they'd make her disappear. The parallel to Elena Rostova's story was impossible to miss. Eliza glanced at Adrian and saw the same recognition in his eyes. She asked about his sister. What was her name? Anya. She was 19, a stupid kid who got in over her head at one of their casinos. And now, his voice cracked. Now she was going to die because he failed. They'd kill her for his failure, and then they'd kill him anyway. So he told Valente to go ahead to do whatever he was planning. He was already dead. Adrian's expression was unreadable. He said Victor came there to murder his wife and child. Why should he care about his sister? Victor met his eye without flinching. He shouldn't. But his wife had asked, so he answered. He told him to do what he wanted with the information. Eliza moved between Adrian and the prisoner, a physical barrier that forced Adrian to look at her. She said they had a choice here. They could do what Victor expected, what the Kozlovs expected, and kill him. Make him disappear. Send a message written in blood. That was the old way, the way this world had always operated. Adrian said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, that he tried to poison her. He came into their home with the explicit intention of murdering her and their baby. The only acceptable response was, what? More violence? More death? Perpetuating the exact cycle that made their world so dangerous that they had to live behind gates and security systems. She placed her hand over her stomach, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. She didn't want their child growing up in a world where the only solution to threats was elimination, where every problem was solved with violence. Adrian's voice was dangerous now, the control slipping. What was she suggesting? That they just let him go? Forgive attempted murder and hope the Kozlovs don't send someone else? She was suggesting they be smarter than they expected. Eliza turned back to Victor. She asked about his sister, where she was now, a safe house in Queens. They were keeping her there until he reported back with confirmation. And the debt amount? $200,000. Victor's laugh was hollow. It might as well have been $2 million. He could never. Eliza looked at her husband. Adrian could. $200,000 was nothing to him, less than he spent on their wedding. They could pay off her debt, extract her from Kozlov territory, and set her up somewhere safe with a new identity. The same thing he did for Elena Rostova. Adrian stared at her like she'd lost her mind. She wanted him to save the sister of the man who came here to kill her. She wanted him to break the cycle. Her voice was firm. Victor was put in an impossible situation. Let his sister die, or try to save her by doing something terrible. The Kozlovs weapon-sized his love for family. They could weaponize it differently, show him there was another way. Adrian said flatly that the other way got them killed. show mercy to their enemies, and they would look weak. Looking weak invited more attacks. This was how his world worked, and he thought she understood that. She did understand it. She was asking him to change it. She moved closer, placing her hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. He promised to try to be different, to be the partner she needed, instead of the jailer he was. This was part of that, choosing a response that didn't just perpetuate violence. And what about justice? What about consequences for trying to murder his family? The consequence was that he failed, and now he lived knowing he owed them his sister's life. Eliza looked back at Victor. She told him he would work for them now, not the Kozlovs. He would provide information about their operations, their plans, their weaknesses. In exchange, they would protect his sister and give them both a chance at a different life. If he betrayed them, the protection would end. But if he honored the agreement, they'd both be safe. Victor was staring at her with something like awe. He asked if she was serious, if she'd actually do this. Adrian said, his voice still tight with anger, but something else creeping in, consideration, that his wife was serious. Whether he agreed to it was another question entirely. Eliza turned back to him, and this time she let him see everything she was feeling. The fear of what Victor had planned, the fury at the Kozlovs for targeting their baby, but also the desperate hope that they could be different from every other powerful family in this world. She wasn't asking him to show mercy because she was naive about the dangers. She was asking because she wanted their child to inherit something better than endless cycles of violence. Because if they could turn an enemy into an asset, if they could save an innocent girl in the process, that was power too. Different power than what he was used to, but maybe more effective in the long run. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the decision. Finally, Adrian exhaled slowly and pulled out his phone. He told Daniel to get him everything on Anya Kozlov, current location, debt details, security around her, and to contact their financial team. He needed $200,000 in cash ready for transfer within the hour. Victor's face went slack with shock. He started to say something, but Adrian cut him off, his voice cold. He told him not to mistake this for kindness. His wife was offering him a chance he would never give on his own. If he betrayed them, lied to them, or gave the Kozlovs any information about their operations or his family, his sister would die first, slowly, while he watched. Then he would die. He asked if he understood. Victor's voice was rough. He understood. He gave his word. Whatever they needed, whatever information they wanted, it was theirs. Adrian told the guards who appeared at his summons to get him cleaned up. Medical attention for the injuries, then secure holding until they'd verified the sister's location and completed the extraction. He wouldn't leave the estate grounds until Adrian was satisfied. This wasn't an elaborate trick. Once they were alone, Adrian turned to Eliza with an expression she couldn't quite read. He said she realized what she just did, right? She'd backed him into a corner in front of an enemy, forced him to show mercy he didn't want to show, and undermined his authority in his own home. She said she knew, and she realized that if this partnership was going to work, if she was going to be an actual partner rather than a decorative wife, sometimes she needed to challenge him publicly. She needed to make him consider options he wouldn't choose on his own. She asked if she overstepped. His voice had lost its edge, completely. She'd undermined him, contradicted his instincts, and forced a decision he was still not entirely comfortable with. She asked if they were fighting about this. He moved closer, and she braced for anger. He said they should be. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that she could feel him shaking. But the truth was, she might be right. Turning Victor could give them eyes inside the Kozlov organization. Saving his sister sent a message different from the one he usually sent, but maybe equally powerful. And most importantly, he pulled back to look at her face. She was willing to stand between him and someone who tried to kill her, to advocate for mercy when she had every right to demand vengeance. That took a kind of strength he'd never possessed. So, he wasn't angry, he was furious and impressed in equal measure. His smile was strained, which he supposed was the definition of partnership. She pushed him to be better. He resisted because it went against every instinct, and eventually they found something in the middle that neither of them would have reached alone. The baby kicked hard enough that Adrian felt it through her clothes. He placed his hand over the spot, and Eliza covered his hand with hers. She said softly that their child was going to grow up seeing this, seeing them navigate impossible choices, make mistakes, try to be better than their circumstances. That was the inheritance she wanted to give them. Not money or power, but the knowledge that change was possible if you were willing to fight for it. Adrian said she was idealistic in ways that terrified him, but also in ways that made him want to be the man she seemed to think he could become. Over the next 72 hours, Adrian's team executed the extraction of Anya Kozlov with military precision. The young woman was transported to the estate in the dead of night, terrified and confused, expecting torture or death. Instead, she found herself in comfortable guest quarters, with her debt paperwork marked paid in full, and her brother very much alive. Eliza met with her privately, woman to woman, explaining the new arrangement without sugarcoating the dangers. Her brother had tried to kill her and her baby. By every law of Adrian's world, they should both be dead. But they were offering something different. New identities, relocation assistance, protection from the Kozlovs. In exchange, Victor provided information and they both stayed loyal. She asked if Anya could live with that. Anya, 19 and exhausted from terror, had simply nodded. She asked why they would save them when they didn't deserve it. Eliza had touched her stomach, because cycles had to break somewhere, and she'd rather her child grow up knowing their parents chose mercy when they could have chosen vengeance. Plus, her brother was in an impossible situation. The Kozlovs made him choose between her and them. They were making it possible for him to choose differently. 2 weeks later, Victor provided intelligence that allowed Adrian to preemptively shut down a major Kozlov operation. The resulting blow to their organization was substantial, far more effective than simply killing one operative would have been. Adrian's associates began whispering about the new strategy, mercy as a weapon, conversion rather than elimination. Not everyone approved. Adrian's uncle Vincent cornered them at a family dinner, his expression troubled. He said Adrian was going soft, showing mercy to people who tried to kill his wife. That wasn't how this business worked. Word would get out, and every two-bit operator would think he was an easy target. Adrian's response was calm but firm. Word would get out that he turned an enemy asset into his own intelligence source, and people would think twice before coming at his family. Viktor Kozlov knew more about his former employers than most of their actual leadership. He'd already provided information that hurt them far worse than his death would have. So, he asked his uncle which approach actually demonstrated strength, the predictable violence or the strategic conversion. Vincent had no answer for that. The pregnancy progressed without further incident. Eliza's belly grew round and prominent, the baby increasingly active. She and Adrian attended every prenatal appointment together. They watched ultrasound images that showed their child developing from abstract shapes into a recognizable human being. When they learned they were having a daughter, Adrian had gone very quiet. Eliza had asked if he was disappointed that it wasn't a son, not an heir in the traditional sense. He admitted he was terrified. A daughter meant teaching her to be strong in a world that would try to undermine her at every turn. It meant protecting her without suffocating her, the way he tried to protect Eliza. It meant raising someone who could navigate his world without becoming a victim of it. Eliza had squeezed his hand. They'd figure it out together, the same way they figured out everything else, one impossible day at a time. They named her Sophia Grace Valente. She arrived 3 weeks early on a cold November morning, small but healthy, with Adrian's dark hair and Eliza's determined expression. The delivery was complicated. 36 hours of labor that left Eliza exhausted, and Adrian more terrified than she'd ever seen him. But when the doctor finally placed Sophia in her arms, everything else fell away. Eliza whispered that she was perfect, studying the tiny face, the miniature fingers that gripped her thumb with surprising strength. Adrian sat beside them on the hospital bed, one arm around Eliza's, the other hand gently touching Sophia's impossibly soft cheek. He said she was everything, their whole world in one 7-pound package. The first weeks of Sophia's life were a blur of sleepless nights and steep learning curves. Adrian proved to be a surprisingly hands-on father, changing diapers and walking the nursery floor at 3 in the morning when Sophia refused to sleep. Eliza would wake to find him holding their daughter against his chest, talking to her in quiet tones about everything and nothing. One night, Not realizing Eliza was awake and listening, he told Sophia he was going to do better than his father did. His father had taught him that power was everything, that showing weakness was unforgivable, that the only way to survive was to control everything and everyone. But her mother was teaching him something different. That strength could look like mercy, that control isn't the same as connection, that sometimes the bravest thing is letting go. Eliza's heart had ached with the tenderness in his voice. This was the Adrian she'd glimpsed during their first dinners together, the one who'd been buried under years of survival instincts and learned cruelty. Fatherhood was excavating that man, bringing him back to the surface. The partnership continued to evolve. They fought regularly about security protocols, about how to handle business complications, about the balance between Sophia's needs and the demands of Adrian's organization. But they also learned to navigate those fights more productively, to hear each other's concerns, and find compromises that honored both perspectives. When Sophia was 6 months old, Adrian made an announcement that shocked his entire organization. He was divesting from several of the more questionable ventures, the gambling operations that preyed on addiction, the lending practices that trapped people in debt, the protection rackets that were really just sophisticated extortion. Instead, he was investing in legitimate businesses, slowly transforming the Valente empire into something that could survive scrutiny. He explained to his incredulous uncle that it wasn't altruism, it was strategy. The world was changing, law enforcement was getting smarter, and public tolerance for organized crime was decreasing. And he had a daughter who deserved to inherit something she could be proud of. So, they would adapt, evolve, and find ways to maintain power that didn't require constant violence. The transformation wasn't instant or complete. Adrian was still involved in activities that existed in legal gray areas. He still wielded power in ways that made Eliza uncomfortable. But the trajectory was clear. He was genuinely trying to build something different, to honor the promise he'd made that night in Toronto. On Sophia's first birthday, they held a small party in the estate gardens. Just family and close friends, none of the ostentatious display that Adrian's position might have demanded. Sophia, who had just started taking her first wobbly steps, delighted in the attention and the cake that ended up mostly on her face. Patricia had flown in from Toronto, and she pulled Eliza aside during the celebration. She needed to admit something. When Eliza went back to him, when she chose to try partnership instead of running, Patricia thought she was making a terrible mistake. She thought he'd revert to his old patterns, and she'd end up trapped again. Eliza watched Adrian across the garden, holding Sophia while she grabbed for the balloons tied to his wrist. And now, Patricia said, she thought she'd underestimated both of them. He was actually changing, and Eliza was actually strong enough to keep pushing him to be better. Patricia's smile was warm. She was sorry she doubted her. Eliza told her not to apologize. She was being protective. And honestly, she wasn't sure it would work either. Eliza touched the sapphire ring on her finger, the symbol of promises made and mostly kept. They still fought, still struggled with balance, but they were building something real. Imperfect, but real. That night, after the guests had left and Sophia was asleep in her nursery, Eliza and Adrian stood together on the terrace overlooking the gardens. It was the same spot where she'd confronted him about Elena Rostova, where so many difficult conversations had taken place. Adrian said quietly, did she remember what she'd asked him on their wedding day? She'd told him to ask her again in a year if she was glad she stayed. She remembered. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been only 18 months. So he was asking, was she glad that she came back, that she gave this partnership a chance, that they built this life together? Eliza thought about the question carefully, refusing to give an easy answer. She thought about the fear of those first weeks back at the estate, the constant negotiation required to maintain boundaries, the fights about control and autonomy that still flared up regularly. But she also thought about watching Adrian become a father, about the way he genuinely transformed parts of his business to give Sophia a cleaner inheritance, about the partnership they'd forged through sheer stubborn determination. She said finally that she was glad. Not because it had been easy or perfect, but because they were both trying every day. They were both choosing to try, and that was more than she thought possible when she signed that contract in Toronto. Adrian pulled her close, and she leaned into his warmth. He was glad, too, She'd made him better than he would have been alone, given him reasons to evolve beyond what his world expected. Their daughter was going to grow up seeing a different kind of power than he inherited, one that included mercy and strategic thinking alongside strength. Eliza pointed out that she was also going to grow up with parents who fought about security protocols and appropriate responses to business threats. They shouldn't romanticize this too much. His hand found hers, their fingers interlacing in a gesture that had become natural over months of practice. He said fighting was part of partnership. Disagreement meant both people had actual opinions worth defending. He'd take honest conflict over silent compliance any day. Inside the nursery, Sophia made a small sound, not quite crying, just letting them know she was awake. They moved together to check on her, finding their daughter standing in her crib, holding the bars for balance, her face lighting up when she saw them. Sophia said clearly, "Mama." Then, with equal enthusiasm, "Da." Adrian lifted her out, settling her between them, as they sat in the rocking chair Eliza had chosen months ago. Sophia curled against her father's chest, already drifting back towards sleep, secure in the knowledge that she was safe and loved. Eliza said softly, watching her daughter's eyes flutter closed, that this was what she was fighting for. This exact moment. A family that was complicated and imperfect, but genuine, where a child could grow up knowing both parents. A family where she could see them navigate difficulties together, learning that love doesn't mean control. Adrian agreed. She was going to have choices they never did. When she was old enough, she'd know the truth about his business, about how they started, about everything, and then she would get to decide what kind of life she wanted. That was the promise. Complete honesty and complete freedom to choose her own path. It was a revolutionary concept in Adrian's world, where children were groomed from birth to take over family operations. But it was also the foundation of the partnership they'd built. Honesty, choice, the freedom to decide, rather than having decisions imposed. The months continued to unfold in patterns of growth and challenge. Viktor Kozlov proved to be an invaluable asset, providing intelligence that allowed Adrian to stay 3 steps ahead of his competitors. The Kozlov organization itself began to crumble under the weight of strategic hits based on insider information. Their power was fragmenting without the dramatic warfare that would have resulted from Adrian's old approach. Other families in Adrian's world took notice of the new strategies. Some condemned them as weakness. Others began quietly adopting similar approaches, recognizing that strategic conversion was often more effective than simple elimination. Adrian became known for a different kind of ruthlessness, one that was calculating rather than violent, that achieved dominance through intelligence and loyalty rather than fear alone. When Sophia turned 2, Adrian made his final major transformation. He announced that within 5 years, the Valente organization would be completely legitimate. All questionable operations would be shut down or sold. All investments moved to legal enterprises. The family name would be associated with business acumen rather than organized crime. The decision cost him. Several key associates left, unwilling to abandon the old ways. His uncle Vincent publicly denounced the plan as betraying everything the Valente family stood for. There were threats from rivals who saw the transition as an opportunity to strike while Adrian was vulnerable. But there were also unexpected allies. Families who'd been looking for an exit strategy from increasingly dangerous operations. Young members of the organization who'd never wanted the violence, but had felt trapped by family expectations. Even some law enforcement officials who quietly approved of Adrian's stated goals, even if they remained skeptical about his methods. Through it all, Eliza stood beside him, offering support and perspective in equal measure. When he was ready to abandon the whole plan after a particularly vicious criticism from old allies, she'd reminded him why it mattered. When he pushed too hard and alienated potential partners, she'd helped him find more diplomatic approaches. The partnership they'd negotiated in that Toronto hotel room had become the foundation for transforming an entire organization. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Adrian presented Eliza with a gift that made her cry. It was a legal document, official papers, showing that the Valente organization had achieved full legitimacy. Every questionable operation had been divested or transformed. The family business now consisted of real estate development, technology investments, and a foundation dedicated to helping people escape situations like Elena Rostova's like Victor and Anya's, Eliza whispered, reading through the documentation, that he did it. He actually transformed everything. Adrian corrected her. They did it. None of this would have happened without her pushing him, challenging him, refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they'd always been. She was the one who insisted change was possible. He just followed her lead. Sophia, now 5 years old and startlingly perceptive, chose that moment to run into the room waving a drawing she'd made. She said, "Mama, Dada, look, I made us a picture." The drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house. Simple, childish, perfect. Sophia had drawn her family exactly as she saw them. Together, equal, connected. Eliza said it was beautiful, just like her, pulling her daughter into a hug. Sophia asked with the directness of childhood if she was happy. She said Dada had told her she used to be sad sometimes, but now she smiled more. Eliza looked at Adrian over their daughter's head, seeing the man he'd become reflected in his eyes. Not perfect. He still struggled with control, still reverted to old patterns under stress, still made decisions that required negotiation and compromise. But he was genuinely transformed from the person who'd kept her prisoner 5 years ago. She said honestly that she was happy. It took a lot of work to get here, and they still had to work every day to keep it. But yes, sweetheart, she was happy. Sophia seemed satisfied with this answer and ran off to add more drawings to her collection. Alone again. Eliza and Adrian stood together in the quiet of the library, surrounded by books and memories and the life they'd built through sheer stubborn determination. Adrian said suddenly that he'd never thanked her for coming back that night in Toronto, for signing the contract and giving him a chance to prove he could change. She could have run forever, could have raised Sophia alone, could have chosen safety over the risk of trying to build something with him. But she didn't. Eliza replied that she came back because she wanted to believe people could change, and because their daughter deserved to know her father. But also, she paused, searching for the right words, because even when he was at his worst, there was something in him that recognized his behavior was wrong. He'd prepared that contract before he even knew if she'd agree to return. That told her he understood partnership wasn't just a word, but a genuine commitment to being different. Adrian acknowledged that the contract had saved them. Having it in writing, having specific terms they'd agreed to, it gave them both something concrete to reference when things got hard. It was structure for the chaos of trying to transform a relationship built on such broken foundations. Eliza suggested they should update it, add new terms now that they'd learned more about how partnership actually worked in practice. She said they should make it evolve the way they had. They spent the evening doing exactly that, sitting together at Adrian's desk, revising the contract that had governed their marriage for 5 years. They added clauses about co-parenting decisions for Sophia. They removed restrictions that were no longer necessary as trust had grown, and formalized the business partnership they'd developed, as Eliza had become increasingly involved in the legitimate ventures Adrian was building. By the time they finished, the document had transformed from a defensive treaty designed to prevent Adrian's worst impulses into a genuine partnership agreement between equals. It acknowledged their different strengths and perspectives while committing both of them to continued growth and change. Adrian said suddenly that they should renew their vows. Not a big ceremony, just them and Sophia and whoever mattered most, but a conscious recommitment to partnership, to the people they'd become instead of the people they were. The idea resonated immediately. In the Rose Garden again, where they first made these promises, but this time without all the fear and uncertainty, this time knowing exactly what they were committing to. They held the renewal ceremony 6 weeks later on a perfect spring morning. Sophia served as flower girl and ring bearer, taking her duties with intense 5-year-old seriousness. Patricia was there along with Marcus and Daniel and Maria, and the handful of people who'd witnessed their evolution from captor and captive to genuine partners. The vows they spoke were nothing like the traditional words from their first wedding. Instead, they'd written their own, honest, and specific to the relationship they'd actually built. Eliza said, holding Adrian's hands, their daughter standing between them, that she promised to continue choosing him. Not because a contract required it or because circumstances trapped her, but because the person he'd become was someone she genuinely wanted to build a life with. She promised to keep challenging him, pushing him to be better, refusing to accept that change was impossible, and she promised to keep trusting him with the parts of herself she was afraid to share, knowing that partnership required vulnerability from both of them. Adrian's voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. He promised to keep earning her trust every single day, to remember that partnership meant consultation, not control. He promised that protecting her didn't mean imprisoning her. He promised to keep transforming, not just his business, but himself, to be worthy of her and the daughter they were raising together. And he promised to never forget where they started, so he would never take for granted how far they'd come, or how much work it took to maintain what they'd built. When they kissed, Sophia clapped enthusiastically, and the small gathering broke into applause. It was nothing like their first wedding. No elaborate ceremony, no society expectations, no performing for an audience. Just two people genuinely choosing each other after years of learning what that choice actually meant. The reception was casual and joyful, held in the same gardens where Eliza had once planned her escape. But now those gardens represented something different. Not a beautiful prison, but a home she'd chosen to build, a foundation for the family they were creating together. As the sun set and Sophia fell asleep in Adrian's arms, exhausted from excitement, Eliza looked around at the life they'd constructed. The estate that had once felt like a cage now held rooms full of genuine joy. Sophia's nursery with its whimsical decorations, the library where they spent quiet evenings, reading together, the office where they collaborated on legitimate business ventures that were actually making positive differences. Adrian asked, noticing her contemplative expression, what she was thinking, that they did it. Against all odds, despite starting from the worst possible foundation, they actually built something real. She touched his cheek, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin. She'd run from here 5 years ago, convinced that freedom and him were mutually exclusive. She thought she had to choose between safety and autonomy, but they'd found a third option, a partnership that included both. They created something neither of them could have built alone. Adrian agreed. He'd still be the person he was, ruthless and isolated and surrounded by enemies if she hadn't forced him to evolve. And she'd be struggling alone, working herself to exhaustion, never knowing what they could become together if they were both willing to try. Sophia stirred in his arms, mumbling something about cake and balloons before settling back into sleep. They carried her inside together. Adrian laying their daughter gently in her bed while Eliza pulled the covers up and smoothed her hair. Eliza whispered, watching Sophia sleep, that she was going to have such different choices than they did. She'd grow up seeing partnership modeled, seeing that people can change, seeing that power doesn't have to mean control or violence. Whatever she chose to become, it would be from genuine freedom rather than necessity or family expectation. Adrian agreed that was the greatest gift they could give her. Not wealth or connections or protection, but the example of two people who refused to accept that they were trapped by their circumstances, who fought to build something better. They stood together in Sophia's doorway, watching their daughter sleep. Both of them, understanding that this was what they'd been fighting for all along. Not perfect love or a fairy tale romance, but genuine partnership built through relentless effort. A family constructed from the most unlikely materials, strengthened by every challenge they'd navigated together. Years later, when Sophia was grown and making her own choices about what kind of life she wanted, she would tell the story of her parents not as a romance, but as a negotiation. Two people who'd started from the worst possible foundation, control and captivity, and built something extraordinary through sheer, stubborn determination to be better than their circumstances required. But that night, standing in their daughter's room, with the evidence of their transformed life all around them, Eliza and Adrian simply held each other and felt grateful. Grateful for the contract that had given them structure. Grateful for the conflicts that had forced them to actually communicate. Grateful for Sophia, who'd given them both motivation to become people worthy of raising her. And most of all, grateful for the choice they'd made over and over again to try, to change, to build partnership from the rubble of captivity and control. It wasn't the ending either of them could have predicted 5 years ago, when Eliza had fled through a stormy night, or when Adrian had tracked her to Toronto. But it was the ending they'd earned through countless difficult conversations, painful compromises, and the daily decision to keep choosing each other despite how much easier it would have been to give up. As they finally left Sophia's room and returned to their own quarters, Eliza paused to look back at the estate sprawling around them. Every room held memories now, both painful and joyful, both challenging and triumphant. This was home. Not because Adrian had trapped her here, but because they'd built it together into something worth staying for. Adrian asked, following her gaze, if she had any regrets. Eliza answered honestly that she had hundreds of regrets about how they started, but none about choosing to try partnership, none about believing he could change, and none about building this life with him. That was the truth of their story. Not that love conquered all or that transformation was easy, but that two people willing to do the hard work of genuine partnership could build something extraordinary from even the most broken beginnings. And as they turned off the lights and settled into bed together, hands intertwined, both of them knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new opportunities to honor or fail the partnership they'd committed to. But they also knew they'd face those challenges together, as equals, as partners, as two people who'd learned that freedom and connection weren't mutually exclusive. They were the twin ambitions of everything worth building. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything they'd fought for and everything they'd become. The story of Eliza and Adrian Valente wasn't about a woman who fell in love with her captor. It was about two people who'd started from the worst possible foundation and built something genuine through a relentless commitment to being better than their circumstances required. It was about partnership as a revolution, change as a choice, and the radical possibility that even people shaped by violence and control could learn different ways of being if they wanted it badly enough. And in the end, they'd wanted it. Both of them. Every single day. That was what made all the difference.